Chapter 10, Part 1 of The Star of Gettysburg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rick Cornwall. The Star of Gettysburg by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. Chapter 10, The Northern March, Part 1. It was days before Harry felt as if life could move on in the usual way. He had loved Jackson next to his father. In fact, in the absence of his own father, the great general had stood in that place to him. He had received from him so many marks of approval, and riding as a trusted member of Jackson's staff, his head had been in such a rosy cloud of glory and victory, that now it seemed for a while as if the world had come to an end. He was disappointed, too, that they had reaped so little from Chancellorsville. He believed at times that his general had died in vain. He had but to ride a little distance and see the enemy across the Rappahannock, where he had been so many months, with the same bristling guns and the same superior forces. He had been eager, like all the other young officers, to move directly after the battle and attack the foe on his own ground, but when he talked with the two colonels he realized that their numbers were too small. They must wait for Longstreet's great division, which had been detached from the battle to guard against a possible flank attack upon Richmond. Oh, if Longstreet and his 20,000 veterans had been at Chancellorsville, and if Jackson had not fallen just at that moment when he was about to complete the destruction of Hooker's right wing. He believed that then they would have annihilated the Army of the Potomac, that only a few fugitives from it would have escaped across the Potomac. The time came to him in after years when he often asked himself, would such a result have been a good result for the American people? But now he was only a boy, as old, it is true, as many boys who led companies, or even regiments, and the days were sufficient for his thoughts. He was not thinking of the distant years and what they might bring. Both he and Dalton felt joy when General Lee sent for them and told them that, having been valued members of General Jackson's staff, they were now to become members of his own. All he asked of them was to serve him as well as they had served General Jackson. Harry was moved so deeply that he could scarcely thank him. He felt springing up in the breast the same affection and hero worship for Lee that he had felt for Jackson. And as the close association with Lee continued, this feeling grew both in his heart and that of Dalton. The soul of youth cannot be kept down, and Harry's spirit returned as he rode back and forth on Lee's errands. Moreover, spring was in full tide, and his blood rose with it. The wilderness in which the dead men lay, and all the surrounding country, were turning a deep green, and the waters of the Rappahannock often flashed in gold or silver as the sun blazed or grew dim. Pleasant relations between the sentries on the two sides of the river were renewed. Tobacco, newspapers, and other harmless articles were passed back and forth, when the officers conveniently turned their backs. Nor was it always that the younger officers turned away. Harry was in a boat near the right bank when he saw another boat about 30 yards from the left shore. It contained a half a dozen men, and he recognized one of the figures at once. Putting his hands, trumpet-shaped, to his mouth, he shouted, "Mr. Shepard! Oh, I say, Mr. Shepard!" The man looked up, and evidently recognized Harry. He had the boat rowed a little nearer. Harry had his own moved forward a little, and he stood at a point where they could talk conveniently. "You may not believe me," said Shepard, "but I felt pleasure when I heard your voice and recognized your face. I am glad to know that you did not fall in the great battle." "I do believe you, and I'm not merely exchanging compliments when I say that I rejoice that you, too, came out of it alive." "Nevertheless, luck was against us then," said Shepard, and Harry, even at the distance, saw a shadow across his face. "I saw the great flank movement of Jackson, and I understood its nature. I was on my way to General Hooker with all speed to warn him, and I would have got there in time had it not been for a chance bullet that stunned me. That bullet cost us thousands of men, and the bullets that struck General Jackson will cost us whole army corps. We hear that they were fired by your own men." "So they were. A North Carolina company in the darkness took us for the enemy." "I don't rejoice over the fall of a great and valiant foe, but whether Jackson lived or died, the result would be the same. I told you long ago that the forces of the Union could never be beaten in the long run, and I repeated it to you another time. Now I repeat it once more. We have lost 2 great battles here, but you make no progress. We menace you as much as ever." "But your newspapers say you're growing very tired. There's no nation so big that it can't be exhausted." "But you'll be exhausted first. So long. I see some of our generals coming out on the bluffs with their glasses. I suppose we mustn't appear too friendly." "Good-bye, Mr. Shepard. We've lost Jackson, but we've many a good man yet. I think our next great battle will be further north." They had not spoken as enemies, but as friends who held different views upon an important point, and now they rowed back peacefully, each to his own shore. With the return of Longstreet, the Southern army was raised to greater numbers than at Chancellorsville. With Stuart's matchless cavalry, it numbered nearly 80,000 men, most of them veterans, and a cry for invasion came from the South. What was the use of victories like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville if they merely left matters where they were? The fighting hitherto had been done on Southern soil. The South alone had felt the presence of the war. It was now time for the North to have a taste of it. Harry and his comrades heard this cry, and it seemed to them to be full of truth. They ought to strike straight at the heart of the enemy. When their victorious brigades threatened Philadelphia and New York, the 2 great commercial centers of the North, then the Northern people would not take defeat so easily. It would be a different matter altogether when a foe appeared at their own doors. Rumors that the invasion would be undertaken soon spread thick and fast. Harry saw his General Lee, now in place of Jackson, in daily conference with his most trusted lieutenants. Longstreet and A.P. Hill were there often, and one day Harry saw riding toward headquarters a man who had only one leg and who was strapped to his saddle. But a strong Roman nose and a sharp, penetrating eye showed that he was a man of force and decision. Once, when he lifted his hat to return a salute, he showed a head almost wholly bald. Harry looked at him for a moment or two, unknowing, and then cried, "General Ewell!" ran forward to greet him. Harry was right. It was what was left of him who had been Jackson's chief lieutenant in the Valley campaigns, and who had fallen wounded so terribly at the Second Manassas. After 9 months of suffering, here he was again, as resolute and indomitable as ever, able to ride only when he was strapped in his saddles, but riding as much as any other general, nevertheless. And Ewell, who might well have retired, was one of those who had most to lose by war. He had a great estate in the heart of a rich country near Virginia's ancient capital, Williamsburg. There he had lived in a large house, surrounded by a vast park, all his own. Even as the man, maimed in body but as dauntless of mind as ever, rode back to Lee, his estate was in the hands of Union troops. He had all to lose, but did not hesitate. Harry saluted him and spoke to him gladly. Ewell returned his piercing eyes upon him, hesitated a moment, and then said, "It's Kenton, young Harry Kenton of Jackson's staff. I remember you in the Valley now. We've lost the great Jackson, but we'll beat the Yankees yet." Then he let loose a volley of oaths, much after the fashion of the country gentlemen of that time, both in America and England. But Harry only smiled. "I'm to have command of Jackson's old corps, the 2nd," said Ewell, "and if you're not placed, I'll be glad to have you on my staff." "I thank you very much, General," said Harry with great sincerity, "but General Lee has taken me over because I was with Jackson." "Then we'll have all the fighting you want," said the indomitable Ewell. "General Lee never hesitates to strike, but don't be the fool that I was and get your leg shot off. If anything has to go, let it be an arm. Look at me. I could ride with any man in all Virginia, a state of horsemen, and now a couple of men have to come and fasten me in the saddle with straps. But never mind." He rode cheerily on, and Harry, turning back, met St. Clair and Langdon. Both showed a pleased excitement. "What is it?" asked Harry. "Colonel Talbot and Lieutenant Colonel St. Hilaire are at it again, and there have been results." "What has happened?" "Colonel Talbot has lost a bishop, and Lieutenant Colonel St. Hilaire has lost a knight. Each claims that he has gained a technical advantage in position, and they've stopped playing to argue about it. From the way they act, you'd think they were Yankee generals. See 'em over there under the boughs of that tree, sitting on camp stools, with the chessmen on another camp stool between them." Harry looked over a little ridge and saw the two colonels, who were talking with great earnestness, each obviously full of desire to convince the other. "My dear Hector," said Colonel Talbot, "each of us has taken a piece. It is not so much a question of the relative value of these pieces as it is of the position into which you force your opponent." "Exactly so, Leonidas. I agree with you on that point, and for that reason I aver that I have made a tactical gain. Hector, you are ordinarily a man of great intelligence, but in this case you seem to have lost some part of your mental powers." "One of us has suffered such a loss, and while I am too polite to name him, I am sure that I am not the man." "Ah, well, we'll not accuse each other while the issue still hangs in doubt. Progress with the game will show that I am right." When Harry passed that way an hour later, they were still bent over the board, the best of friends again, but no more losses had been suffered by either. May was almost spent, and spring was at the full. The Southern army was now at its highest point in both numbers and effectiveness. Only Jackson was gone, but he was a host and more, and when Lee said that he had lost his right arm, he spoke the truth, as he was soon to find. Yet the Southern power was at the zenith, and no shadow hung over the veteran, and devoted troops who were eager to follow Lee in that invasion of the North of which all now felt sure. Doubts were dispelled with the close of May. Harry was one of the young officers who carried the commander-in-chief's orders to the subordinate generals, and while he knew details, he wondered what the main plan would be. Young as he was, he knew that no passage could be forced across the Rappahannock in the face of the Army of the Potomac, which was now as numerous as ever, and which could sweep the river and its shores with its magnificent artillery. But he had full confidence in Lee. The spell that Jackson had thrown over him was transferred to Lee, who swayed his feelings and judgment with equal power. The figure of Lee in the height and fullness of victory was imposing. An English general who saw him, and who saw all the famous men of his time, wrote long afterward that he was the only great man he had ever seen who looked all his greatness. Tall, strongly built, with thick gray hair, a short gray beard, clipped closely, ruddy complexion, and blue eyes, he was as careful in dress as Jackson had been careless. He spoke with a uniform politeness, not superficial, but from the heart, and his glance was nearly always grave and benevolent. General Lee, in those warm days of late spring, occupied a large tent. Even when the army was not on the march, he invariably preferred tents to houses, and now Harry saw nearly all the famous Southern generals in the East passing through that door. There was Longstreet, blue of eye like Lee, full-bearded, thick and powerful, and proud of his horsemanship, in which he excelled. Ewell, too, stumped in on his crutches, vigorous, enthusiastic, but never using profane language where Lee was. And there was A.P. Hill, of soldierly slenderness and of fine, pleasing manner. McLaws, who had done so well at Antietam. Pickett, not yet dreaming of the one marvelous achievement that was to be his. Old Jubal Early, as he was familiarly called, bald, bearded, rheumatic, profane, but brave and able. Hood, tall, yellow-haired. Pender, the North Carolinian, not yet 30, religious like Jackson, and doomed like him to fall soon in battle. Teeth, Edward, Johnson, Anderson, Trimble, Stuart, as gay and dandish as ever. Ramseur, Jones, Daniel, young Pittsburgh Lee, Pendleton, Armistead, and a host of others whose names remain memorable to him. They were all tanned and sunburned men. Few had reached early middle age, and the shadows of death were already gathering for many of them. But the high spirits of the Southern army merely became higher as they began to make rapid but secret preparation for departure. The soldiers did not know where they were going, except that it was into the North, and they began to discuss the nature of the country they would find there. Harry took the message to the Invincibles to pack and march. Colonel Talbot and Lieutenant Colonel St. Hilaire reluctantly dropped their unfinished game, put up the chessmen, and in an hour the Invincibles, few but trim and strong, were marching to a position farther up the river. The corps of Longstreet was to lead the way, and it would march the next morning. Harry now knew that the army would advance by way of the Shenandoah Valley. The Northern troops had been raiding in the Great Valley and again had retaken Winchester, the pleasant little city so beloved of Jackson. Harry shared the anger at this news that Jackson would have felt had he been alive to hear it. Harry was well aware, however, that the army could not slip away from its opponent. Hooker, still in command, was watching on the heights across the river, and there were the captive balloons hovering again in the sky. But the spirit of the troops was such that they did not care whether their march was known or not. Harry and Dalton were awake early on the morning of the 3rd of June, and they saw the corps of Longstreet file silently by, the bugle that called them away being the first note of the great and decisive Gettysburg campaign. They were better clothed and in better trim than they had been in a long time. They walked with an easy, springy gait, and the big guns rumbled at the heels of the horses, fat from long rest and the spring grass. They were to march north and west to Culpeper, 50 miles away, and there await the rest of the army. Harry and Dalton felt great exhilaration. Movement was good not only for the body but for the spirit as well. It made the blood flow more freely and the brain grow more active. Moreover, the beauty of the early summer that had come incited one to greater hope. End of Chapter 10, Part 1. Recording by Rick Cornwall. Chapter 10, Part 2 of The Star of Gettysburg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rick Cornwall. The Star of Gettysburg by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. Chapter 10, The Northern March, Part 2. The great adventure had now begun, but it was not unknown to Hooker and his watchful generals on the other shore. The ground was dry, and they had seen a column of dust rise and move toward the northwest. Their experienced eyes told them that such a cloud must be made by marching troops, and the men in the balloons with their glasses were able to catch the gleam of steel from the bayonets of Longstreet's men as they took the long road to Gettysburg. Hooker had good men with him. He, too, as he stood on the left bank of the Rappahannock, was surrounded by able and famous generals, and others were to come. There was Meade, a little older than the others, but not old, tall, thin, stooped a bit, wearing glasses, and looking like a scholar, with his pale face and ragged beard, a cold, quiet man, able and thorough, but without genius. Then came Reynolds, modest and quiet, who many in the army claimed would have shown the genius that Meade lacked had it not been for his early death, for he too, like Pender, would soon be riding to a soldier's grave. And then were Doubleday and Newton and Hancock, a great soldier, a man of magnificent presence, whose air and manner always inspired enthusiasm, soon to be known as Hancock the Superb; Sedgwick, a soldier of great insight and tenacity; Howard, a religious man who was to come out of the war with only one arm; Hunt and Gibbon and Webb and Sykes and Slocum and Pleasanton, who commanded the cavalry, and many others. These men foresaw the march of Lee into the North, and the people behind them realized that they were no longer carrying the battle to the enemy. He was bringing it to them. Apprehension spread through the North, but it was prepared for the supreme effort. The Army of the Potomac, despite Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, had no fear of its opponent, and the veterans in blue merely asked for another chance. On the following morning and the morning after, Ewell's corps followed Longstreet in 2 divisions toward the general rendezvous at Culpeper Courthouse, but Lee himself, although most of his troops were now gone, did not yet move. Hill's corps had been held to cover any movement of the Army of the Potomac at Fredericksburg, and Lee and his staff remained there for 3 days after Longstreet's departure. The Invincibles had gone, but Harry and Dalton were just behind Lee, who sat on his white horse, Traveler, gazing through his glasses toward a division of the Army of the Potomac, which on the day before had crossed the Rappahannock, under a heavy fire from Hill's men. But Harry knew that it was no part of Lee's plan to drive these men back across the river. A. P. Hill, on the heights would hold them and would be a screen between Hooker's army and his own. So the young staff officer merely watched his commander, who looked long through his glasses. It was now nearly noon, and the June sky was brilliant with the sun moving slowly toward the zenith. Lee at length lowered his glasses, and turning to his staff, said, "Now, gentlemen, we ride." Harry, by some chance, looked at his watch, and he always remembered that it was exactly noon when he started on the journey that was to lead him to Gettysburg. He and Dalton, from a high crest, looked back toward the vast panorama of hills, valleys, rivers, and forests that had held for them so many thrilling and terrible memories. There lay the blackened ruins of Fredericksburg. There were the heights against which the brave Northern brigades had beat in vain and with such awful losses. And beyond, far down under the horizon, was the tragic wilderness in which they had won Chancellorsville and in which Jackson had fallen. Harry choked and turned away from the fresh wound that the recollection gave him. Lee and his staff rode hard all that afternoon and most of the night through territory guarded well against Northern skirmishers or raiding bands, and the next day they were with the army at Culpeper Courthouse. Meanwhile, Hooker was undecided whether to follow Lee or move on Richmond, but the shrewd Lincoln telegraphed him that Lee was his true objective. At that moment the man in the White House at Washington was the most valuable general the North had, knowing that Lee in the field with his great fighting force must be beaten back, and that otherwise Richmond would be worth nothing. It was Harry's fortune in the most impressionable period of life to be in close contact for a long time with two very great men, both of whom had had an influence upon him, creating for him new standards of energy and conduct. In after years, when he thought of Lee and Jackson, which was nearly every day, no weighing of the causes involved in the quarrel between the sections was made in his mind. They were his heroes, and personally they could do no wrong. As Lee rode on with his staff through the fair Virginia country, he talked little, but more than was Jackson's custom. Harry saw his brow wrinkle now and then with thought. He knew that he was planning all the time, and he knew, too, what a tremendous task it was to bring all the scattered divisions of an army to one central point in the face of an active enemy. This task was even greater than Harry imagined, as Lee's army would soon be strung along a line of 100 miles, and a far-seeing enemy might cut it apart and beat it in detail. Lee knew, but he showed no sign. Harry felt an additional elation because he rode westward and toward that valley in which he had followed Jackson through the thick of great achievements. In the North they had nicknamed it the Valley of Humiliation. But Jackson was gone, and Milroy, whom he had defeated once, was there again, holding and ruling the little city of Winchester. Harry's blood grew hot because he too, as Jackson had, loved Winchester. He did not know what was in Lee's mind, but he hoped that a blow would be struck at Milroy before they began the great invasion of the North. Culpeper was a tiny place, a courthouse, and not much more, but now its eager and joyous citizens welcomed a great army. Although Hill and his corps were yet back watching Hooker, 50,000 veterans were gathered at the village. Soon they would be 70,000 or more, and Culpeper rejoiced yet again. The women and children, the men were but few, gone to the war, were never too tired to seek glimpses of the famous generals, whom they regarded as their champions. Stuart, in his brilliant uniform, at the head of his great cavalry command, appealed most to the young, and his gay spirit and frank manners delighted everybody. They paid little attention to the Northern cavalry and infantry on the other side of the Rappahannock, knowing that Hooker's main army was yet far away, and feeling secure in the protection of Lee and his victorious army. Harry slept heavily that night, wearied by the long ride. He, Dalton, and two other young officers had been assigned to a small tent, but taking their blankets they slept under the stars. Harry seldom cared for a roof now on a dry, warm night. He had become so much used to hardships and unlimited spaces that he preferred his blankets and the free breezes that blew about the world. It was a long time after the war before he became thoroughly reconciled to bedrooms in warm weather. He was aroused the next morning by Dalton, who pulled him by his feet out of his blankets. "Stick your head in a pail of water," said Dalton, "and get your breakfast as soon as you can. Everything is waiting on you." "How dare you, George, drag me by the heels that way? I was marching down Broadway in New York at the head of our conquering army, and millions of Yankees were pointing at me, all saying with one voice, 'That's the fellow that beat us.' Now you've spoiled my triumph, and what do you mean by saying that everything is waiting for me? Our army, as you know, is spectacular only in its achievements, but today we intend to have a little splendor. The Commander in Chief is going to review Jeb Stuart's cavalry. For dramatic effect, it's a chance that Stuart won't miss." "That's so. Just tell him I'm coming and that the parade can begin." Harry bathed his face and had a good breakfast, but there was no need to hurry. Jeb Stuart, as Dalton had predicted, was making the most of his chance. He was going not only to the parade, but to have a mock battle as well. As the sun rose higher, making the June day brilliant, General Lee and his staff, dressed in their best, rode slowly to a little hillock commanding a splendid view of a wide plain lying east of Culpeper Courthouse. General Lee was in a fine uniform, his face shaded by the brim of the gray hat which pictures have made so familiar. His cavalry cape swung from his shoulders, but not low enough to hide the splendid sword at his belt. His face was grave and his whole appearance was majestic. If only Jackson were there, riding by his side. Harry choked again. Lee sat on his white horse, Traveler, and above him on a lofty pole a brilliant Confederate flag waved in the light wind. Harry and Dalton, as the youngest, took their modest places in the rear of the group of staff officers, just behind Lee, and looked expectantly over the plain. They saw at the far edge a long line of horsemen, so long in fact that the eye did not travel its full distance. Nearer by, all the guns of Stuart's horse artillery were posted upon a hill. Harry's heart began to beat at the sight. Mimic, not real, war, but thrilling nevertheless. A bugle suddenly sounded far away, its note coming low but mellow. Other bugles along the line sang the same tune, and then came rolling thunder as 10,000 matchless horsemen, led by Stuart himself, charged over the plain straight toward the hill on which Lee sat on his horse. The horsemen seemed to Harry to rise as if they were coming up the curve of the earth. It was a tremendous and thrilling sight. The hoofs of 10,000 horses beat in unison. Every man held aloft his sabre, and the sun struck upon their blades and glanced off in a myriad brilliant beams. Harry glanced at Lee, and he saw that the blue eyes were gleaming. He, too, sober and quiet though he was, felt pride as the Murat of the South led on his legions. The cavalrymen, veering a little, charged toward the guns on the hill, and they received them with a discharge of blank cartridges which made the plain shake. Back and forth the mimic battle rolled, charge and repulse, and the smoking of the firing drifted over the plain. But the wild horsemen wheeled and turned, always keeping place with such superb skill that the officers and the infantry looking on burst again and again into thunderous applause. The display lasted some time. When it was over and the smoke and dust were settling, General Lee and his staff rode back to their quarters, the young officers filled with pride at the spectacle and more confident than ever that their coming invasion of the North would be the final triumph. Northern cavalry on the other side of the river had heard the heavy firing, and they could not understand it. Could their forces following Lee on the right bank be engaged in battle with him? They had not heard of any such advance by their own men, yet they plainly heard the sounds of a heavy cannonade, and it was a matter into which they must look. They had disregarded sharp firing too often before, and they were growing wary. But with the wariness also came a daring which the Union leaders in the East had not usually shown hitherto. They had a strong cavalry force in 3 divisions on the other side of the river, and the commanders of the divisions, Buford, Gregg, and Duffy, with Pleasanton over all, were forming a bold design. Events were to move fast for Harry, much faster than he was expecting. He was sent that night with a note to Stuart, who went into camp with his 10,000 cavalry and 30 guns on a bare eminence called Fleetwood Hill. The base of the hill was surrounded by forest, and not far away was a little place called Brandy Station. Harry was not to return until morning, as he had been sent late with a message, and after delivering it to Stuart, he hunted up his friend Sherburne. He found the captain sitting by a low campfire, and he was made welcome. Sherburne, after the parade and sham battle, had cleaned the dust from his uniform, and he was now as neat and trim as St. Clair himself. "Sit down, Harry," he said with the greatest geniality. "Here, orderly, take his horse, but leave him his blankets. You'll need the blankets tonight, Harry, because you bunk with us in the end of the greenwood tree. We've got a special tree, too. See it there, the oak with the great branches." "I'll never ask anything better in summertime, provided it doesn't rain," said Harry. "Wasn't that a fine parade?" Sherburne ran on. "And this is the greatest cavalry force that we've had during the war. Why, Stuart can go anywhere and do anything with it. A lot of Virginia scouts under Jones are watching the fords, and we've got with us such leaders as Fitz Lee, Robertson, Hampton, and the commander-in-chief's son, W.H.F. Lee. Why should a man be burdened with three initials? We can take care of any cavalry force that the Yankees may send against us." "I've noticed in the recent fighting," said Harry, "that the Northern cavalrymen are a lot better than they used to be. Most of us were born in the saddle, but they had to learn to ride. They'll give us a tough fight now whenever we meet 'em." "I agree with you," said Sherburne, "but they can't beat us. You can ride back in the morning, Harry, and report to the commander-in-chief that he alone can move us from this position. Listen to that stamping of hoofs. Among 10,000 horses a lot are likely to be restless. And look there at the hilltop where 30 good guns are ready to turn their mouths on any foe." "I see them all," said Harry, "and I think you're right. I'll ride back peacefully to General Lee in the morning and tell him that I left 10,000 cavalrymen lying lazily on the grass, and 10,000 horses eating their heads off near Brandy Station." "But tonight you rest," said one of the young officers. "Do you smoke?" "I've never learned." "Well, I don't smoke either unless we get 'em from the Yankees. That's what's left of a box that we picked up near the Chancellor House. It may have belonged to old Joe Hooker himself, but if so, he'll never get it back again." He distributed the cigars among the smokers, who puffed them with content. Meanwhile the noises of the camp sank, and presently Harry, taking his blankets and saying good night, went to sleep in the end of the greenwood tree. End of Chapter 10, Part 2. Recording by Rick Cornwall. Chapter 11, Part 1 of The Star of Gettysburg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rick Cornwall. The Star of Gettysburg by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. Chapter 11, The Cavalry Combat, Part 1. Harry was a fine sleeper. One learns to be in long campaigns. Most of those about him slept as well, and the 10,000 horses which had been ridden hard in the great display during the day also sank into quiet. The restless hoofs ceased to move. Now and then there was a snort or a neigh, but the noise was slight on Fleetwood Hill or in the surrounding forest. A man came through the thickets soon after midnight, and moved with the greatest caution toward the hill on which the artillery was ranged. He was in neither blue nor gray, just the plain garb of a civilian, but he was of a strong figure, and his smoothly shaven face, with its great width between the eyes and massive chin, expressed character and uncommon resolution. The intruder, he was obviously such, because he sought with the minutest care to escape observation, never left the shelter of the bushes. He had all the skill of the old forest runners, because his footsteps made no sound as he passed, and he knew how to keep his figure always in the shadows until it became a common blur with them. His was a most delicate task, in which discovery was certain death, but he never faltered. His heart beat steadily and strong. It was an old risk to him, and he had the advantage of great natural aptitude, fortified by long training in a school of practice where a single misstep meant death. The sharp eyes of the spy missed nothing. He counted the 30 pieces of artillery on the hill. He estimated with amazing accuracy the number of Stuart's horsemen. He saw 1,000 proofs that the heavy firing he had heard in the course of the day was not due to battle with Northern troops. Although he stopped at times for longer looks, he made a wide circuit about the Confederate camp, and he was satisfied that Stuart, vigilant and daring though he might be, was not expecting an enemy. Shepard's heart for the first time beat a little faster. He had felt as much as any general the Northern defeats and humiliations in the East, But, like officers and soldiers, he was not crushed by them. He even felt the tide might be about to turn. Lee, evading the North, would find before him many of the difficulties which had faced the Northern generals attacking the South. Shepard, a man of supreme courage, resolved that he would spare no effort in the service to which he had devoted himself. He spent fully 4 hours in the thickets, and then, feeling that he had achieved his task, bore away toward the river. Taking off his coat and belt with pistols in it, and fastening them about his neck, he swam with bold strokes to the other side of the stream. However, had anyone been on the watch at that very point, it was not likely that he would have been seen. It was the approach of dawn, and heavy mists were rising on the Rappahannock, as they had risen at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Shepard gave the countersign to the pickets and was shown at once to General Pleasonton, an alert, vigorous man who was awaiting him. His report was satisfactory, because the cavalry general smiled and began to send quick orders to his leaders of divisions. But the peace in Stuart's command was not broken that night. No one had seen the figure of the spy sliding through the thickets, and Harry and his comrades in the inn of the greenwood tree were very warm and snug in their blankets. As day came he yawned, stretched, closed his eyes again, thinking that he might have another precious 15 minutes, but recalling his resolution, sprang to his feet and began to rub his eyes clear. He had slept fully dressed like all the rest, and he intended to go down to a brook in a few minutes and bathe his face. But he first gave Sherburne a malicious shove with his foot, and bade him wake up, telling him that it was too late for an alert cavalry captain to be sleeping. Then Sherburne also yawned, stretched, and stood up, rubbing his eyes. The others about him rose too, and everybody felt chilled by the river fog, which was uncommonly heavy. "Breakfast for me," said Sherburne. "Not just now, I think," said Harry. "Listen, aren't those rifle shots?" Patter, patter, distant but clear in the morning, came from a point down the stream. "You're right!" exclaimed Sherburne in alarm. "It's on our side of the river, and it's increasing fast. As sure as we live, the enemy has crossed and attacked." They were not left in doubt. Pickets running in told them the heavy force of Northern cavalry was across the Rappahannock and was charging with vigor. In fact, 2 of the divisions had passed the fords unseen in the fog, and were now rushing Stuart's camp. But Stuart, although surprised, never for an instant lost his presence of mind. Throughout the Southern lines the bugles sounded the sharp call to horse. It was full time. The outposts had been routed already and were driven in on the main body. Harry ran to his horse, which had been left saddled and bridled for any emergency. He leaped upon him and rode by the side of Sherburne, whose troop was already in line. They could not see very well for the mist, but the fire in front of them from cavalry carbines had grown into great violence. It made a huge shower of red dots against the white screen of the mist, and now they heard shouts and the beat of thousands of hoofs. "They're making for our artillery!" exclaimed Sherburne with true instinct. "Follow me, men. We must hold them back for a few minutes at least." Sherburne and his gallant troops were just in time. A great force of cavalry in blue suddenly appeared in the whitish and foggy dawn, and charged straight for the guns. Without delaying a moment, Sherburne flung his troops in between, although they were outnumbered 20 to 1 or more. He did not expect to stop them. He merely hoped to delay them for a few minutes, and therefore he offered himself as a sacrifice. Harry was beside Sherburne as they galloped straight toward the Northern cavalry, firing their short carbines and then swinging their sabers. "They'll ride over us," he shouted to Sherburne. "But we'll trouble 'em a little as they pass," the captain shouted back. Harry shut his teeth hard together. A shiver ran over him, and then his face grew hot. The pulses in his temple beat heavily. He was sure that Sherburne and he and all the rest were going to perish. The long and massive Northern line was coming on fast. They too had fired their carbines, and now thousands of sabers flashed through the mist. Harry was swinging his own sword, but the great force bore down upon them. The white mist seemed to turn red, and the long line of horsemen fused into a solid mass, its front flashing with steel. He became conscious, as the space between them closed rapidly, that a heavily crackling fire was bursting from a wood between the Northern cavalry and the river. The Southern skirmishers, brushed away at first, had returned swiftly, and now they were sending a rain of bullets upon the blue cavalrymen. Many saddles were emptied, but the line went on and struck Sherburne's troop. Harry saw a man lean from his horse and slash at him with a saber. He had no sabre of his own, only a small sword, but he cut with all his might at the heavy blade instead of the man, and he felt, rather than saw, the two weapons shatter to pieces. Then his horse struck another, and reeling in the saddle, he snatched out a pistol and began to fire at anything that looked like a human shape. He heard all about him a terrible tumult of shots and shouts, and the thunder of horses' hoofs. He still saw the red mist and 1,000 sabres flashing through it, and he heard, too, the clash of steel on steel. The Northern line had been stopped 1 minute, 2 minutes, and maybe 3. He was conscious afterward that in some sort of confused way he was trying to measure the time, but he was always quite certain that it was not more than 3 minutes. Then the Northern cavalry passed over them. Harry's horse was fairly knocked down by the impetus of the Northern charge, and the young rider was partly protected by his body from the hoofs that thundered over them. Horse and rider rose together. Harry found that the reins were still clenched in his hand. His horse was trembling all over from shock, and so was he, but neither was much harmed. Beyond him the great cavalry division was galloping on, and he gazed at it a moment or two in a kind of stupor. But he became conscious that the fire of the Southern skirmishers on its flank was growing heavier, and that many horses without riders were running loose through the forest. Then his gaze turned back to the little band that had stood in the path of the whirlwind, and he uttered a cry of joy as he saw Sherburne rising slowly to his feet, the blood flowing from a wound in his left shoulder. "It isn't much, Harry," said the captain. "It was only the point of the sabre that grazed me, but my horse was killed, and the shock of the fall stunned me for a moment or two. Oh, my poor troop!" There was good cause for his lament. Less than 1/4 of his brave horsemen were left unhurt or with but slight wounds. The wounded who could rise were limping away toward the thickets, and the unwounded were seeking their mounts anew. Harry caught a riderless horse. His faculties were now clear, and the effect of the physical shock had passed. "We held 'em 3 minutes at least, Captain," he cried, "and it may be that 3 minutes were enough. We were surprised, but we are not beaten. Here, jump up. We've saved the guns from capture, and listen how the rifle fire is increasing." Sherburne sprang into the saddle, and his little band of surviving troopers gathered around him. They uttered a shout, too, as they saw heavy forces of their own cavalry coming up and charging, sabre in hand. Inspired by the sight and forgetting his wound, Sherburne wheeled about and led his little band in a charge upon the Northern flank. A desperate battle with sabres ensued. Forest and open rang with shouts and the clash of steel, and hundreds of pistols flashed. The Northern horsemen were driven back. Davis, who led them here, a Southerner by birth but a regular officer, a man of great merit, seeking to rally them, fell, wounded mortally. A strong body of Illinois troopers came up and turned the tide of battle again. The Southern horsemen were driven back. Some of them were taken prisoners, and a part of Stuart's baggage became a Northern prize. This portion of the Southern cavalry under Jones, which Harry and Sherburne had joined, now merely sought to check the Northern advance until Stuart could arrive. Everyone expected Stuart. Such a brilliant cavalryman could not fail. But the Northern force was increasing. Buford and his men were coming down on their flank. It seemed that the Confederate force was about to be overwhelmed again, but suddenly their guns came into action. Shell and canister held back the Northern force, and then arose from the Southern ranks the shout, "Stuart! Stuart!" Harry saw him galloping forward at the head of his men, his long, yellow hair flying in the air, his sabre whirled aloft in glittering circles, and he felt an immense sensation of relief. Leading his division in person, Stuart drove back the Northern horsemen, but he in his turn was checked by artillery and supporting columns of infantry in the wood. Pleasanton, the Union leader, was showing great skill and courage. Having profited by his enemy's example, he was pressing his advantage to the utmost. Already he had found in Stuart's captured baggage instructions for the campaign, showing that the whole Southern army was on its way toward the Great Valley to march thence northward, and he resolved instantly to break up this advance as much as possible. Pleasanton pressed forward again, and Stuart prepared to meet him, but Harry, who was keeping by the side of Sherburne, saw Stuart halt suddenly. A messenger had galloped up to him, and he brought formidable news. A heavy column of horsemen had just appeared directly behind the Southern cavalry and was marching to the attack. Stuart was in a trap. Harry saw that Stuart had been outgeneraled, and again he shut his teeth together hard. To be outgeneraled did not mean that they would be outfought. The Northern force in their rear was the 3rd Division under Gregg, and Stuart sent back cavalry and guns to meet them. Harry now saw the battle on all sides of him. Cavalry were charging, falling back, and charging again. The whole forces of the two armies were coming into action. Nearly 20,000 sabres were flashing in the sunlight that had driven away the fog. Harry had never before seen a cavalry battle on so grand a scale, but the confusion was so great that it was impossible for him to tell who was winning. The Northern force took Fleetwood Hill. Stuart retook it. Then he sought to meet the cavalry division in his front and drove it to the woods, where it reformed and hurled him back to the hill. The Northern division under Gregg, that had come up behind, fell with all its force on the Southern flank. Had it driven in the Southern lines here, Pleasanton's victory would have been assured, but the men in gray, knowing that they must stand, stood with a courage that defied everything. The heavy Northern masses could not drive them away, and then Stuart, whirling about, charged the North in turn with his thousands of horsemen. They were met by more Northern cavalry coming up, and the combat assumed a deeper and more furious phase. Sherburne, with the fragment of his troop and Harry by his side, was in the charge. The effect of it upon Harry, as upon his older comrade, was bewildering. The combatants, having emptied their pistols or thrust them back in their belts, were now using their sabres alone. Nearly 20,000 blades were flashing in the air. Again the battle was face to face, and the lines became mixed. Riderless horses, emerging from the turmoil, were running in all directions, many of them neighing in pain and terror. Men, dismounted and wounded, were crawling away from the threat of the trampling hoofs. The gunners fired the cannon whenever they were sure they would not strike down their own, but the horsemen charged upon them and wrenched the guns from their hands, only to have them wrenched back again by the Southerners. It was the greatest cavalry battle of the war, and the spectacle was appalling. Many of the horses seemed to share the fury of their riders, and kicked and bit. Their biting hoofs raised an immense cloud of dust, through which the blades of the sabres still flashed. Harry never knew how he went through it unhurt. Looking back, it seemed that such a thing was impossible. Yet it occurred. But he became conscious that the Southern horsemen, after the long and desperate struggle, were driving back those of the North. They had superior numbers. One of the Northern divisions, after having been engaged with infantry elsewhere, failed to come up. Pleasanton, after daring and skill that deserved greater success, was forced slowly to withdraw. Roused by the roar of the firing, heavy masses of Ewell's infantry was now appearing on the horizon, sent by Lee with orders to hurry to the utmost. Pleasanton, maintaining all his skill and coolness, dexterously withdrew his men across the river, and Stuart did not consider it wise to follow. Each side had lost heavily. Pleasanton had not only struck a hard blow, but he had learned where Lee's army lay, and moreover he had shown the horsemen of the South that those of the North were on the watch. It was late in the afternoon when the last Northern rider crossed the Rappahannock, and Harry looked upon a field strewn with the fallen, both men and horses. Then he turned to Sherburne and bound up his wounded shoulder for him. The hurt was not serious, but Sherburne, although they had been driven off the Northern horse, was far from sanguine. "It's a Pyrrhic victory," he said. "We had the superior numbers, and it was all we could do to beat them back. Besides, they surprised us when we thought we had a patent on that sort of business." "It's so," said Harry, his somber glance passing again over the field. Their feeling was communicated, too, to the advancing masses of infantry. The soldiers, when they saw the stricken field and began to hear details from their brethren of the horse, shook their heads. There was no joy of victory in the Southern army that night. The enemy, when he was least expected, had struck hard and was away. Harry rode to General Lee and gave him as many details as he could of the cavalry battle, to all of which the general listened without comment. He had reports from others also, and soon he dismissed Harry, who took up his usual night quarters with his blankets under a green tree. Here he found Dalton, who was eager to hear more. "They say that the Yankees, although inferior in numbers, pushed us hard. Harry, is it so?" he asked. "It is, and they caught us napping, too. George, I'm beginning to wonder what's waiting for us there in the North." It was dark now, and he gazed toward the north, where the stars already twinkled serenely in the sky. It seemed to him that their army was about to enter some vast, illimitable space, swarming with unknown enemies. He felt for a little while a deep depression, but it was partly physical. His exertions of the day had been tremendous, and the intense excitement, too, had almost overcome him. The watchful Dalton noticed his condition and wisely said nothing, allowing his pulses to begin their normal beat. It was nearly an hour before his nerves became quiet, and then he sank into a heavy sleep. In the morning, youth had reasserted itself, both physically and mentally. His doubts and apprehensions were gone. The unconquerable Army of Northern Virginia was merely marching again to fresh triumphs. Although Hooker now understood Lee's movement and was pushing more troops forward on his side of the Rappahannock, the Southern general, with his eye ever on his main object, did not cease his advance. He had turned his back on Washington, and nothing, not even formidable eruptions like that of Pleasanton, could make him change his plan. The calls from the Valley of Virginia became more frequent and urgent. Messengers came to Lee begging his help. Milroy at Winchester, with a strong force, was using rigorous measures. The people claimed that he had gone far beyond the rules of war. Jackson had come more than once to avenge them, and now they expected as much of Lee. End of Chapter 11, Part 1. Recording by Rick Cornwall. Chapter 11, Part 2 of The Star of Gettysburg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rick Cornwall. The Star of Gettysburg by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. Chapter 11. The Cavalry Combat, Part 2. They did not appeal in vain. Harry saw Lee's eyes flash at the reports of the messengers, and he himself took a dispatch, the nature of which he knew, to Ewell, who was in advance, leading Jackson's old corps. Ewell, strapped to his horse, had regained his ruddiness and physical vigor. Harry saw his eyes shine as he read the dispatch, and he knew that nothing could please him more. "You know what is in this, Lieutenant Kenton?" he said, tapping the paper. "I do, sir, and I'm sorry I can't go with you." "So am I. But as sure as you and I are sitting here on our horses, trouble is coming to Mr. Milroy. Some friends of yours in the little regiment called the Invincibles are just beyond the hill. Perhaps you'd like to see them." Harry thanked him, saluted, and rode over the hill, where he found the two colonels, St. Clair and Langdon, riding at the head of their men. The youths greeted him with a happy shout, and the colonels welcomed him in a manner less noisy, but as sincere. "The sight of you, Harry, is good for any kind of eyes," said Colonel Talbot. "But what has brought you here?" "An order from General Lee to General Ewell." "Then it must be of some significance." "It is, sir, and since it will be no secret in a few minutes, I can tell you that this whole corps is going to Winchester to take Milroy. I wish I could go with you, Colonel, but I can't." "You were at Brandy Station, and we weren't," said St. Clair quietly. "It's our turn now." "Right you are, Arthur," said Langdon. "I mean to take this man Milroy with my own hands. I remember that he gave us trouble in Jackson's time. He's been licked once. What right has he to come back into the valley?" "He's there," said Harry, "and they say he's riding it hard with iron-shod hoofs." "He won't be doing it by the time we see you again," said St. Clair confidently as they rode away. Harry did not see them again for several days, but when Ewell's division rejoined the main army, all that St. Clair predicted had come to pass. St. Clair himself, with his left arm in a sling, where it was to remain for a week, gave him a brief and graphic account of it. All the soldiers in the army that he had once led knew how Old Jack loved that town, he said, and they were on fire to drive the Yankees away from it once more. We marched fast. We were the foot cavalry just as we used to be, and do you know, that Cajun band was along with our brigade as lively as ever. The Yankees had heard of our coming, but late. They had already built forts around Winchester, but they didn't dream until the last moment that a big force from Lee's army was at hand. Their biggest fort was on Apple Pie Ridge, some little distance from Winchester. We came up late in the afternoon and had to rest a while as it was awfully hot, and then we opened, with General Ewell himself in direct command there. Old Jube Early had gone around to attack their other works, and we were waiting to hear the roaring of his guns. We gave it to 'em hot and heavy. General Ewell was on foot, that is, one foot and a crutch, and you ought to have seen him hopping about among the falling cannon balls, watching and ordering everything. Sunset was at hand, with Milroy fighting us back, and not dreaming that Early was coming on his flank. Then we heard Early's thunder. In a few minutes his men stormed the fort on the hill next to him and turned its guns upon Milroy himself. It was now too dark to go much further with the fighting, and we waited until the next morning to finish the business. But Milroy was a slippery fellow. He slid out in the night somehow with his men, and was 5 miles away before we knew he had gone. But we followed hard, overtook him, captured 4,000 men and 23 cannon, and scattered the rest in every direction. Wasn't that a thorough job? Stonewall Jackson would never have let them escape through his cordon and got a start of 5 miles. That's so, Harry. Old Jack would never have allowed it. But then, Harry, you've got to remember there's only been one Stonewall Jackson, and there's no more to come. You're telling the whole truth, St. Clair, and if General Ewell did let him get away, he caught him again. It was a brilliant deed, and it cleared the valley of the enemy. Our scouts have reported that some of the fugitives have reached Pennsylvania, spreading the alarm there. I suppose they'll be gathering troops in our front now. What's the news from Hooker, Harry? He's moving northwest to head us off, but I don't think he has any clear idea where we're going. Where are we going, Harry? It's more than I can tell. Maybe we're aiming for Philadelphia. Then there'll be a big stir among the Quakers, said Happy Tom. It doesn't matter, young gentlemen, where we're going, said Colonel Talbot, who heard the last words. It's our business to be led, and we knew that we're in the hands of a great leader. And we know that, too, whatever dangers he leads us into, he'll share them to the full. Am I not right, Hector? You speak the full truth, Leonidas. Aye, aye, sir, said Harry. It's sufficient for us to follow where General Lee leads. But we need a great victory, said Colonel Talbot. We've had news from the southwest. The enemy has penetrated too far there. That fellow Grant is a perfect bulldog. They say he actually means to take our fortress of Vicksburg. He always hangs on, and that's bad for us. If we win this war, we've got to win it with some great stroke here in the east. You speak with your usual penetration and clearness, Leonidas, said Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire, and then the two rode on, side by side, firm, quiet figures. Now came days when suspense and fear hung heavy over the land. The sudden blow out of the dark that had destroyed Milroy startled the North. The fugitives from his command told alarming stories of the great Southern force that was advancing. The division of Hill, watching Hooker on the Rappahannock, also dropped into the dark where Lee's main army had already gone. The Army of the Potomac took up its march on a parallel line to the westward, but it was never able to come into close contact with the Army of Northern Virginia. There were clouds of skirmishes and cavalry between. Undaunted by his narrow escape at Brandy Station, Stuart showed all his old fire and courage, covering the flanks and spreading out a swarm of horsemen who kept off the Northern scouts. Thus Lee was still able to veil his movements in mystery, and the anxious Hooker finally set forward a great force to find and engage Stuart's cavalry. Stuart, now acting as a rear guard, was overtaken near the famous old battlefield of Manassas. For a long time he fought greatly superior numbers and held them fast until nightfall, when the Northern force, fearing some trap, fell back. Harry had been sent back with 2 other staff officers, and from a distance he heard the crash and saw the flame of the battle. But he had no part in it, merely reporting the result late in the night to his general, who speedily pressed on, disregarding what might occur on his flanks or in his rear, sure that his lieutenants could attend to all the dangers there. The days were full of excitement for Harry. While he remained near Lee, the far-flung cavalry continually brought in exciting reports. As Harry saw it, the North was having a taste of what she had inflicted on the South. The news of Milroy's destruction, startling enough in itself, had been magnified as it spread on the wings of rumor. The same rumor enlarged Lee's army and increased the speed of his advance. Sherburne, recovered from his slight wound, was the most frequent bringer of news. There was not one among all Stuart's officers more daring than he, and he was in his element now as they rode northward into the enemy's country. He told how the troopers had followed Milroy's fugitives so closely that they barely escaped across the Potomac, and then how the Unionists of Maryland had fled before the gray horsemen. Sherburne did not exaggerate. Hitherto the war had never really touched the soil of any of the free states, but now it became apparent that Pennsylvania, the second state of the Union in population, would be invaded. Excitement seized Harrisburg, its capital, which Lee's army might reach at any time. People poured over the bridges of the Susquehanna, and thousands of men labored night and day to fortify the city. Jenkins, a Southern cavalry leader, was the first to enter Pennsylvania, his men riding into the village of Greencastle and proceeding thence to Chambersburg. While the telegraph all over the North told the story of his coming, and many thought that Lee's whole army was at hand, Jenkins turned back. He was merely a small vanguard, and Lee had not yet drawn together his whole army into a compact body. The advance of Lee with a part of his army was harassed moreover by the Northern cavalry, which continued to show the activity and energy that it had displayed so freely at Pleasanton's battle with Stuart. Harry, besides bearing messages for troops to come up, often saw, as he rode back and forth, the flame of firing on the skyline, and he heard the distant mutter of both rifle and cannon fire. Some of these engagements were fierce and sanguinary. In one, more than 1,000 men fell, a half to either side. Harry was shot at several times on his perilous errands, and once he had a long gallop for safety. Then Lee stopped a while at the Potomac, with his army on both sides of the river. He was waiting to gather all his men together before entering Pennsylvania. Already they were in a country that was largely hostile to them, and now Harry saw the difficulty of getting accurate information. The farmers merely regarded them with lowering brows, and refused to say anything about Union troops. Harry had parted company for the time with his friends of the Invincibles. They were far ahead with Ewell, while he and Dalton remained with Lee on the banks of the Potomac. Yet the delay was not as long as it seemed to him. Soon they took up their march and advanced on a long line across the neck of Maryland into Pennsylvania, here a region of fertile soil, but with many stony outcrops. The little streams were numerous, flowing down to the rivers, and horses and men alike drank thirstily at them, because the weather was now growing hot and the marching was bad. It was near the close of the month when Harry learned that Hooker had been relieved of the command of the Army of the Potomac at his own request, and that he had been succeeded by Meade. "Do you know anything about Meade?" he asked Dalton. "He's been one of the corps commanders against us," replied the Virginian, "and they say he's cautious. That's all I know." "I think it likely that we'll find out before long what kind of general he is," said Harry thoughtfully. "We can't invade the North without having a big battle." The corps of Hill and Longstreet were now joined under the personal eye of Lee, who rode with his two generals. Ewell was still ahead. Finally they came to Chambersburg, which the Southern advance had reached earlier in the month, and Lee issued an order that no devastation should be committed by his troops, an order that was obeyed. Harry and Dalton walked a little through the town, and menacing looks met them everywhere. "We've treated 'em well, but they don't like us," he said to Dalton. "Why should they? We come as invaders, as foes, not as friends. Did our people in the Virginia towns give the Yankees any very friendly looks?" "Not that I've heard of. I suppose you can't make friends of a people when you come to make war on, even if you do speak kind words to them." "Is General Stuart here?" asked Dalton. "No, he's gone on a great raid with his whole force. I suppose he's going to sweep up many detachments of the enemy. And meanwhile we're going on to Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania. But it seems to me that Stuart ought to be with us." "Maybe he's gone to find out just where the Army of the Potomac is. We've lost Meade, and Meade has lost us. Some prisoners that we brought in say that nobody in the North knows just where our army is, although all know that it's in Pennsylvania." But that night, while Harry was at General Lee's headquarters, a scout arrived with news that the Army of the Potomac was advancing upon an almost parallel line and could throw itself in his rear. Other scouts came one after another with the same report. Harry saw the gravity with which the news was received, and he speedily gathered from the talk of those about him that Lee must abandon his advance to the Pennsylvania capital and turn and fight, or be isolated far from Virginia, the southern base. Stuart and the cavalry were still absent on a great raid. Lee's orders to Stuart were not explicit, and the cavalry leader's ardent soul gave them the widest interpretation. Now they felt the lack of his horsemen, who in the enemy's country could have obtained abundant information. A spy had brought them news that the Army of the Potomac had crossed the Potomac and was marching on a parallel line with them, but at that point their knowledge ended. The dark veil, which was to be lifted in such a dramatic and terrible manner, still hung between the two armies. The weather turned very warm, as it was now almost July. So far as the heat was concerned, Harry could not see any differences between Pennsylvania and Kentucky and Virginia. In all three the sun blazed at this time of the year. But the country was heavy with crops, now ripening fast. It was a region that Harry liked. He had a natural taste for broken land with slopes, forests, and many little streams of clear water. Most of the fields were enclosed in stone fences, and the great barns and well-built houses indicated prosperous farmers. He and Dalton rode up to one of these houses, and finding every door and window closed, knocked on the front door with a pistol butt. They knew it was occupied, as they had seen smoke coming from the chimney. "This house surely belongs to a Dutchman," said Dalton, meaning one of those Pennsylvanians of German descent who had settled in the rich southeast of Pennsylvania generations ago. "I fear they don't know how to talk English," said Harry. "They can if they have to. Hit that door several times more, Harry, and hit it hard. They're a thrifty people, and they wouldn't like to see a good door destroyed." Harry beat a resounding tattoo until the door was suddenly thrown open, and the short figure of a man of middle years, chin-whiskered and gray, but holding an old-fashioned musket in his hands, confronted them. "Put down that gun, Herr Schneider. Put it down at once," said Dalton, who had already leveled his pistol. The man evidently was no coward, but when he looked into Dalton's eyes, he put the musket on the floor. Harry, still sitting on his horse, they had ridden directly up to the front door, saw a stalwart woman and several children hovering in the dusk of the room behind the man. He watched the whole group, but he left the examination to Dalton. "I want you to tell me, Herr Schneider, the location of the Army of the Potomac, down to the last gun and man, and what are the intentions of General Meade," said Dalton. The man shook his head and said, "Nein." "Nine!" said Dalton indignantly. "General Meade has more than 9 men with him. Come out with the story. All those tales about the rebels coming to burn and destroy are just tales, and nothing more. You understand what I'm saying well enough. Come out with your information." "Nein," said the German. "All right," said Dalton in a ferocious tone. "After all, we are the rebel ogres that you thought we were." He turned toward his comrade, and with his back toward the German, winked and said, "What do you think I'd better do with him?" "Oh, kill him," replied Harry carelessly. "He's broad between the eyes, and there's plenty of room there for a bullet. You wouldn't miss at 2 yards." The German made a dive toward his musket, but Dalton cried sharply, "Hands up, or I shoot!" The German straightened himself, and holding his hands aloft, said, "You would not kill me in the shelter of mine own house?" "Well, that depends on the amount of English you know. It seems to me, Herr Schneider, that you learned our language very suddenly." "I was a man who learns very fast when it was necessary. Mein brain works in a manner most wonderful when I looks down the barrel of a big pistol." "The pistol is a marvellous stimulant to a good education." "How did you know my name was Schneider?" "Intuition, Herr Schneider, intuition. We Southern people have wonderful intuitive faculties." "Well, it was not Schneider. My name was Jacob Onderdonk." Harry laughed and Dalton reddened. "The joke is on me, Mr. Onderdonk," said Dalton, "but we're here on a serious errand. Where is General Meade?" "I have not had my regular letter from General Meade this morning." "Wilma, you are sure you have nothings from General Meade?" "Nothings, Jacob," she said. Walton flushed again and muttered under his breath. "We want to know," he said sharply, "if you have seen the Army of the Potomac or heard anything of it." A look of deep sadness passed over the face of Jacob Onderdonk. "I have one great weakness," he said, "one dot makes my life most bitter. I have the poorest memory in the world. Sometimes I forget the face of mine own Wilma. Maybe the Army of the Potomac, 100,000 men, passed right before my door yesterday. Maybe as der weather was hot, that if one of them 100,000 came right into their house and took a cool drink out of the old water bucket. But I cannot remember. Alas, my poor memory!" "Then maybe Wilma remembers." "Sh! Do not speak of dot poor woman. I do not let her out of the house these days, as she may not be able to find her way back in again." "We'd better go, George," said Harry. "I think we only waste time asking questions of such a forgetful family." "It is so," said Onderdonk. "But, young Mr. Rebels, I remember one thing." "And what is that?" asked Dalton. "It vas a piece of advice dot I ought to gif you. You tell dot General Lee to turn his horse's head and ride back to der South. You're good young rebels, I can see that in your faces. Ride back to der South, I tell you again. We are too many for you up here. Der field of corn is so thick and so long dot you cannot cut your way through it. Your knife may be sharp and heavy, but it will wear you out first. Do I not tell the truth, Wilma, mein wife?" "All your life you've been a speaker of der truth, Hans, mein husband." "I think you're a poor prophet, Mr. Onderdonk," said Dalton. "We recognize, however, the fact that we can't get any information out of you. But we ask one thing of you." "Vot is dot?" "Please to remember that while we two are rebels, as you call them, we neither burn nor kill. We have offered you no rudeness whatever, and the Army of Northern Virginia is composed of men of the same kind." "I vill remember it," said Onderdonk gravely, and as they saluted him politely, he returned the salute. "Not a bad fellow, I fancy," said Harry as they rode away. "No, but our stubborn enemy all the same. Wherever our battle is fought, we'll find a lot of these Pennsylvania Dutchmen standing up to us to the last." Harry and Dalton rejoined the staff, bringing with them no information of value, and they marched slowly on another day, camping in the cool of the evening, both armies being now lost to the anxious world that waited and sought to find them. Lee himself, as Harry gathered from the talk about him, was uncertain. He did not wish a battle now, but his advance toward the Susquehanna had been stopped by the news that the Army of the Potomac could cut in behind. The corps of Ewell had been recalled, and Harry, as he rode to it with the message from his general, saw his old friend again. They were in a tiny village, the name of which he forgot, and Colonel Talbot and Lieutenant Colonel St. Hilaire, sitting in the main room of what was used as a tavern in times of peace, had resumed the game of chess, interrupted so often. Lieutenant Colonel St. Hilaire was in great glee, just having captured a pawn, and Colonel Talbot was eager and sure of revenge when Harry entered and stated that he had delivered an order to General Ewell to fall back yet further. Most untimely," exclaimed Colonel Talbot, as they rapidly put away the board and chessmen. "I was going to drive Hector into a bad corner when you came and interrupted us." "You are my superior officer, Leonidas," said Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire, "but remember that this superiority applies only to military rank. I assert now, with all respect to your feelings, that in regard to chess it does not exist, never has, and never will." "Opinions, Hector, are opinions. Time alone decides whether they are or not facts. But our corps is to fall back, you say, Harry? What does it signify?" "I think, Colonel, that it means a great battle very soon. It is apparent that General Lee thinks so, or he would not be concentrating his troops so swiftly. The Army of the Potomac is somewhere on our flank, and we shall have to deal with it." "So be it. The Invincibles are few, but ready." Harry rode rapidly back to Lee with the return message from Ewell, and found him going into camp on the eve of the last day of June. The weather was hot, and scarcely any tents were set, nearly everybody preferring the open air. Harry delivered his message, and General Lee said to him with his characteristic kindness, "You'd better go to sleep as soon as you can, because I shall want you to go on another errand in the morning to a place called Gettysburg." Gettysburg! Gettysburg! He had never heard the name before, and it had absolutely no significance to him now. But he saluted, withdrew, procured his blankets, and joined Dalton. "The General tells me, George, that I'm going to Gettysburg," he said. "What's Gettysburg, and why does he want me to go there?" "I'm to be with you, Harry, and we're both going with a flying column, in order that we may report upon its conduct and achievements. So I've made inquiries. It's a small town surrounded by hills, but it's a great center for roads. We're going there because it's got a big shoe factory. Our role is to be that of shoe buyers. Harry, stick out your feet at once." Harry thrust them forward. "One sole worn through, the heel gone from the other shoe. And even then, you're better off than most of us. Lots of the privates are barefooted, so you needn't think that the role of shoe buyer is an ignominious one." "I'll be ready," said Harry. "Call me early in the morning, George. We've got a long way from home, and the woods are not full of friends. Getting up here in these Pennsylvania hills, one has to look pretty hard to look away down south in Dixie." "That's so, Harry. A good sleep to you, and tomorrow as shoe buyers we'll ride together to Gettysburg." He lay between his blankets, went quickly to sleep, and dreamed nothing of Gettysburg, of which he had heard for the first time that day. End of Chapter 11, Part 2. Recording by Rick Cornwall.
Chapter 12, Part 1 of The Star of Gettysburg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard. The Star of Gettysburg by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. Chapter 12. The Zenith of the South. Part 1. The sun, on the first day of July, which was to witness the beginning of the most tremendous event in the history of America, dawned hot and clouded with vapors. They hung in the valleys, over the steep stony hills, and along the long blue slopes of South Mountain. The mists made the country look fantastic to Harry, who was early in the saddle. The great uplifts and projections of stone assumed the shapes of castles and pyramids and churches. Over South Mountain, on the west, heavy black clouds floated, and the air was close and oppressive. "Rain, do you think?" said Harry to Dalton. "No, it's just a sultry day. Maybe the wind will spring up and drive away all these clouds and vapors. At least I hope so. There's the bugle. We're off on our shoe campaign." "Who leads us?" "We go with Pettigrew, and Heth comes behind. In a country so thick with enemies, it's best to move only in force." The column took up its march, and a cloud of dust followed it. The second half of June had been rainy, but there had been several days of dry weather now allowing the dust to gather. Harry and Dalton soon became very hot and thirsty. The sun did not drive away the vapors as soon as they had expected, and the air grew heavier. "I hope they have plenty of good drinking water in Gettysburg," said Harry. "It will be nearly as welcome to me as shoes." They rode on over hills and valleys, and brooks and creeks, the names of none of which they knew. They stopped to drink at the streams, and the thirsty horses drank also. But it remained hard for the infantry. They were trained campaigners, however, and they did not complain as they toiled forward through the heat and dust. They came presently to round hillocks, over which they passed, and then they saw a fertile valley watered by a creek, and beyond that the roofs of a town with orchards behind it. "Gettysburg," said Dalton. "It must be the place," said Harry. "Picturesque, isn't it? Look at those two hills across there, rising so steeply." One of the hills, the one lay farther to the south, a mass of apparently inaccessible rocks, rose more than 200 feet above the town. The other, about a third of a mile from the first, was only half its height. They were Round Top and Little Round Top. In the mists and vapors, and at the distance, the two hills looked like ancient towers. Harry and George gazed at them, and then their eyes turned to the town. It was a neat little place, with little roads radiating from it as if it were the hub of a wheel, and the thrifty farmers of that region had made it the center for their schools. Harry had learned from Jackson, and again from Lee, always to note well the ground wherever he might ride. Such knowledge in battle was invaluable, and his eyes dwelled long on Gettysburg. He saw running south of the town a long high ridge, curving at the east and crowned with a cemetery, because of which the people of Gettysburg called it Cemetery Ridge, or hill. Opposed to it, some distance away and running westward, was another but lower ridge which they called Seminary Ridge. Beyond Seminary Ridge there were other and yet lower ridges, between two of which flowed a brook called Willoughby Run. Beyond them all, 2 or 3 miles away and hemming in the valley, stretched South Mountain, the crests of which were still clothed in the mists and vapors of a sultry day. Near the town was a great field of ripening wheat, golden when the sun shone. Not far from the horsemen there was another little stream called Plum Run. They also saw an unfinished railroad track with a turnpike running beside it, the roof and cupola of a seminary, and beside the little marshy stream of Plum Run, a mass of jagged, uplifted rocks commonly called the Devil's Den. Harry knew none of these names yet, but he was destined to learn them in such a manner that he could never forget them again. Now he merely admired the peaceful and picturesque appearance of the town, set so snug among its hills. "That's Gettysburg, which for us just at this moment is the shoe metropolis of the world," said Dalton. "But I dare say we'll not be welcomed as purchasers or in any other capacity." "You take a safe risk, George," said Harry. "Tales that we are terrible persons, who rejoice most in arson and murder, evidently have been spread pretty thoroughly through this region. Both sections scatter such stories. I suppose it's done in every war. It's only human nature." "All right, Mr. Pedantic Philosopher. Maybe you're telling the truth. But look, I don't think we're going into Gettysburg in such a great hurry. Yankee soldiers are there before us." Other Southern officers had noted the blue uniforms and the flash of rifle barrels and bayonets in Gettysburg. As they used their glasses, the town came much nearer, and the Union forces around it increased. Buford, coming up the night before, had surmised that the Southern force would advance on Gettysburg, and he had chosen a place for a battle. He had with him 4,200 mounted men, and he posted them in the strong positions that were so numerous. He had waited there all night, and already his scouts had informed him that Pettigrew and Heth were advancing. "Are we to lose our shoes?" whispered Harry. "I don't think so," replied Dalton in an undertone. "We have a strong force, and I don't see any signs that our generals intend to turn back. Harry, your glasses are much stronger than mine. What do you see?" "I see a lot. The Yankees must be 4,000 or 5,000, and they are posted strongly. They are thick in the railroad cut, and hundreds of horses are held up by men in the rear. It must be almost wholly a cavalry force." "Do you see any people in the town?" "There is not a soul in the streets, and as far as I can make out, all the doors are closed and the windows shuttered." "Then it's a heavy force waiting for us. The people know it, and expecting a battle, they have gone away." "Your reasoning is good, and there's a bugle to confirm it. Our lines are already advancing." It was still early in the morning, and the strong Southern force, which had come for shoes but which found rifles and bayonets waiting for them instead, advanced boldly. They, the victors of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, had no thought of retreating before a foe who invited them to combat. Harry and Dalton found their hearts beating hard at their very first battle on northern soil, and Harry's eyes once more swept the great panorama of the valley, the silent town, the lofty stone hills, and far beyond the long blue wall of South Mountain, with the mists and vapors still floating about its crest. Heth was up now, and he took full command, sending 2 brigades in advance, the brigades themselves preceded by a great swarm of skirmishers. Harry and Dalton rode with one of the brigades, and they closely followed those who went down on the right bank of the stream called Willoughby Run, opening a rapid fire as they advanced upon a vigilant enemy. who had been posted the night before in protected positions. Buford's men met the attack with courage and vigor. 4,000 dismounted cavalry, all armed with carbines, sent tremendous volleys from the shelter of ridges and earthworks. The fire was so heavy that the Southern skirmishers could not stand before it, and they too began to seek shelter. The whole Southern column halted for a few minutes, but recovered itself and advanced again. The battle blazed up with a suddenness and violence that astonished Harry. The air was filled in an instant with the whistling shells and bullets. He heard many cries. Men were falling all around him, but so far he and Dalton were untouched. Heth, Davis, Archer, and the others were pushing on the troops, shouting encouragement to them, and occasionally, through the clouds of smoke which were thickening fast, Harry saw the tanned faces of their enemies loading and firing as fast as they could with rifle and cannon. The Northern men had shelter, but were fewer in number. The soldiers in gray were suffering the heavier losses, but they continued to advance. The battle swelled in volume and fierceness along the banks of Willoughby Run. There was a continuous roar of rifles and cannon, and the still, heavy air of the morning conducted the sound to the divisions that were coming up, and to the trembling inhabitants of the little town, who had fled for refuge to the farmhouses in the valley. Harry and George had still managed to keep close together. Both had been grazed by bullets, but these were only trifles. They saw that the division was not making any progress. The men in blue were holding their ground with extraordinary stubbornness, although the Southern fire coming closer had grown much more deadly. They refused to yield. Buford, who had chosen that battlefield, and who was the first to command upon it, would not let his men give way. His great hour had come, and he may have known it. Watching through his glasses, he had seen the long lines of Southern troops upon the hills, marching toward Gettysburg. He knew that they were the corps of Hill, drawn by the thunder of the battle, and he felt that if he could hold his ground yet a while longer, help for him too would come, drawn in the same manner. Harry once caught sight of this officer, a native of Kentucky like himself. He was covered with dust and perspiration, but he ran up and down, encouraging his men, and often aiming the cannon himself. It was good fortune for the North that he was there that day. The Southern generals, uncertain whether to push the battle hard or wait for Lee, recoiled a little before his tremendous resistance. But the South hesitated only for a moment. Hill, pale from an illness but always full of fire and resolution, was hurrying forward his massive columns, with eagerness growing as the sound of the battle swelled. They would overwhelm the Union force, sweep it away. Yet the time gained by Buford had value beyond all measurements. The crash of the battle had been heard by Union troops too, and Reynolds, one of the ablest Union generals, was leading a great column at the utmost speed to the relief of the general who had held his ground so well. A signalman stationed in the belfry of the seminary reported to Buford the advance of Reynolds, and the officer, eager to verify it, rushed up into the belfry. Then Buford saw the columns coming forward at the double quick, Reynolds in his eagerness galloping at their head and leaving them behind. He looked in the other directions and saw the men of Hill advancing with equal speed. He saw on one road the stars and stripes, and on the other the stars and bars. He rushed back down the steps and met Reynolds. "The devil is to pay," he cried to Reynolds. "How do we stand?" "We can hold on until the arrival of the First Corps." Buford sprang on his horse, and the two generals, reckless of death, galloped among the men, encouraging the faint-hearted, reforming the lines, and crying to them to hold fast, that the whole Army of the Potomac was coming. Harry felt the hardening of resistance. The smoke was so dense that he could not see for a while the fresh troops coming to the help of Buford, but he knew nevertheless that they were there, and he had heard a great shouting behind him as Hill's men, coming upon the field, rushed into action. But Jackson, the great Jackson whom he had followed through all his victories, the man who saw and understood everything, was not there. The genius of battle was for the moment on the other side. Reynolds, so ably pushing the work that Buford had done, was seizing the best positions for his men. He was acting with rapidity and precision, and the troops under him felt that a great commander was showing them the way. His vigor secured the slopes and crest of Cemetery Hill, but the Southern masses nevertheless were pouring forward in full tide. The combat had now lasted about 2 hours, and a stray gust of wind lifting the smoke a little, Harry caught a glimpse of a vast blazing amphitheater of battle. He had regarded it at first as an affair of vanguards, but now he realized suddenly that this was the great battle they had been expecting. Within this valley and on these ridges and hills it would be fought, and even as the thought came to him, the conflict seemed to redouble in fury and violence, as fresh brigades rushed into the thick of it. Harry's horse was killed by a shell as he rode toward the wood on the Cashtown Road, which both sides were making a desperate effort to secure. Fortunately, he was able to leap clear and escape unhurt. In a few moments Dalton was dismounted in almost the same manner, but the two on foot kept at the head of the column and rushed with the skirmishers into the bushes. There they knelt, and began to fire rapidly on the Union men who were advancing to drive them out. Harry saw an officer in a general's uniform leading the charge. The bullets of the skirmishers rained upon the advance. One struck this general in the head when he was within 20 yards of the riflemen, and he fell stone dead. It was the gallant and humane Reynolds falling in the hour of his greatest service. But his troops, wild with ardor and excitement, not noticing his death, still rushed upon the wood. The charge came with such violence and in such numbers that the Southern skirmishers and infantry in the wood were overpowered. They were driven in a mass across Willoughby Run. 1,000, General Archer among them, were taken prisoner. Harry and Dalton barely escaped, but in all the tumult and fury of the fighting they found themselves with another division of the Southern army, which was resisting a charge made with the same energy and courage that marked the one led by Reynolds. But the charge was beaten back, and the Southerners following were repulsed in their turn. The battle, which had been raging for 3 hours with the most extraordinary fury, sank a little. Harry and Dalton could make nothing of it. Everything seemed wild, confused, without precision or purpose, but the fighting had been hard and the losses great. Heth now commanded on the field for the South, and Doubleday for the North. Each general began to rectify his lines and try to see what had happened. The Confederate batteries opened, but did not do much damage, and while the lull continued, more men came for the North. Harry and Dalton had found their way to Heth, who told them to stay with him until Lee came. Heth was making ready to charge a brigade of stalwart Pennsylvania lumbermen, who, however, managed to hold their position, although they were nearly cut to pieces. Hill now passed along the Southern line, and like other Southern leaders, uncertain what to do in this battle brought on so strangely and suddenly, ceased to push the Union lines with infantry, but opened a tremendous fire from 80 guns. The whole valley echoed with a crash of the cannon, and the vast clouds of smoke began to gather again. The Union forces suffered heavy losses, but still held their ground. End of Chapter 12, Part 1. Recording by Michael Packard. Chapter 12, Part 2 of The Star of Gettysburg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard. The Star of Gettysburg by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. Chapter 12. The Zenith of the South. Part 2. Harry thought, while this comparative lull and close fighting was going on, that Dalton and he should get back to General Lee with news of what was occurring, although he had no doubt the commander-in-chief was now advancing as fast as he could with the full strength of the army. Still, duty was duty. They had been sent forward that they might carry back reports, and they must carry them. "It's time for us to go," he said to Dalton. "I was just about to say that myself. We can safely report to the general that the vanguards have met at Gettysburg, and that there are signs of a battle." Dalton took a long, comprehensive look over the valley, in which 30 or 40,000 men were merely drawing a fresh breath before plunging anew into the struggle, and said, "Yes, Harry, all the signs do point that way. I think we can be sure of our news." They had not been able to catch any of the riderless horses galloping about the field, and they started on foot, taking the road which they knew would lead them to Lee. They emerged from some bushes in which they had been lying for shelter, and 2 or 3 bullets whistled between them. Others knocked up the dust in the path as a shell shrieked a terrible warning over their heads. They dived back into the bushes. "Didn't you see that sign out there in the road?" asked Harry. Sign? I saw no sign," said Dalton. "I did. It was a big sign, and it read in big letters, 'No thoroughfare.'" "You must be right. I suppose I didn't notice it because I came back in such a hurry." They had become so hardened to the dangers of war that, like thousands of others, they could jest in the face of death. "We must make another try for it," says Dalton. "We've got to cross that road. I imagine our greatest danger is from the sharpshooters at the head of it." "Stoop low and make a dash. Here goes." Bent at almost double, they made a hop, skip, and a jump, and were in the bushes on the other side, where they lay for a few moments, panting, while the hair on their heads, which had risen up, lay down again. Quick as had been their passage, fully a dozen ferocious bullets whined over their heads. "I hate skirmishers," said Harry. "It's one thing to fire at a mass of the enemy, but it's another to pick out a man and draw a bead on him." "I hate 'em too, especially when they are a-firing at me," said Dalton. "But, Harry, we're doing no good lying here in the bushes, trying to press ourselves into the earth so the bullets will pass over our heads." "Heavens, what was that?" "Only the biggest shell ever made bursting near us. You know, those Yankee artillerymen were always good, but I think they've improved since they first saw us trying to cross that road. To think, an entire army turning away from its business to shoot at 2 fellows like ourselves, who asked nothing but to get away. And it's time we were going. The bushes rise over our heads here. We must make another dash." They rose and ran on. But to their alarm, the bushes soon ended as they emerged into a field. Here they came directly into the line of fire again, and bullets sang and whistled around them. Once more they read in invisible but significant letters the sign, "No thoroughfare," and darted back into the wood from which they had just come, while shells, not aimed at them, but at the armies, shrieked over their heads. "It's not the plan of fate that we should reach General Lee just yet," said Harry. "The shells and bullets say it isn't. What do you think we ought to do?" Harry rose up cautiously and began to survey their position. Then he uttered a cry of joy. "More of our men are coming," he exclaimed. "And they are coming in heavy columns. I see their gray jackets and their tanned faces, and there, too, are the Invincibles. Look, and you can see the 2 colonels riding side by side, and just behind them are St. Clair and Langdon." Dalton's eyes followed Harry's pointing finger, and he saw. It was a joyous sight, the masses of their own infantry coming down the road in perfect order, and their own personal friends not 200 yards away. But the Northern artillerymen had seen them too, and they began to send up the road a heavy fire which made many fall. Ewell's men came on, unflinching, until they unlimbered their own guns, and began to reply with fierce and rapid volleys. The 2 youths sprang from the bushes and rushed directly into the gray links of the Invincibles, before they could be fired upon by mistake as enemies. The 2 colonels had dismounted, but they recognized the fugitives instantly and welcomed them. "Why this hurry, Lieutenant Kenton?" said Colonel Talbot politely. "We were trying to reach General Lee, and not being able to do so, we were anxious to greet friends." "And so it would seem. I do not recall another such swift and warm greeting. But we're glad, Leonidas, that they found refuge with us," said Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire. "So we are, Hector. Down here, lads, for your lives!" The colonel had seen a movement in the hostile artillery, and at his sharp command all the Invincibles and the two lads threw themselves on their faces, not a moment too soon, as a hideous mass of grape and canister flew over their heads. The Invincibles, rising to their feet, sent a return volley from their rifles, and then, at the command of a general, fell back behind their own cannon. The Northern artillery in front was shifted, evidently to protect some weaker positions of their line, but the Southern troops in the road did not advance farther at present, awaiting a report of the scouts who were quickly sent ahead. "You're welcome at our command," said Langdon, "but I notice that you come on foot and in a hurry. We're glad to protect officers on the staff of the Commander-in-Chief whenever they appeal to us." "Even when they come running like scared colts," said St. Clair. "Why, happy I saw both of them jump clean over the bushes 10 feet high." "You would have jumped over trees 100 feet high if 100,000 Yankees were shooting at you as they were shooting at us," rejoined Harry. "What place is this in the valley, Harry?" asked Colonel Talbot. "It's called Gettysburg, sir. We've heard that it was full of shoes. We went there this morning to get 'em, but we found instead it was full of Yankees. And they know how to shoot, too," said Lieutenant Colonel St. Hilaire. "We saw all the thunder of a great battle as we came up." "You haven't come too soon, sir," said Dalton. "The Yankees are fighting like fiends, and we've made very little headway against 'em. Besides, sir, fresh men are continually coming up for 'em." "And fresh men have now come from our side, too," said Colonel Leonidas Talbot proudly. "I fancy that a division of Jackson's old corps will have a good deal to say about the result." "What part of the corps, sir, is this?" asked Harry. "Rodes' division. General Ewell himself has not yet arrived, but you may be sure he's making the utmost haste with the rest of the division." Rodes, full of eagerness, now pushed his troops forward. Hill, who saw his coming with unmeasured joy, shifted his men, until they were fully in touch with those of Rodes, the whole now forming a great curving line of battle, frowning with guns, the troops burning for a new attack. Harry looked up at the sun, which long ago had pierced the mists and vapors, but not the smoke. He saw to his surprise that it had reached and passed the zenith. It must now be at least 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he was about to look at his watch, when the Southern trumpets at that moment sounded the charge, and knowing no other way to go, he and Dalton fell in with the Invincibles. Howard was in command of the Northern army at this time, and from the roof of a house in Gettysburg he had been watching the Southern advance. He and Doubleday gathered all their strength to meet it, and despite the new troops brought by Rodes, Hill was unable to drive them back. Harry felt, as he had felt all along, that marked hardening of the Northern resistance. The battle wavered. Sometimes the North was driven back, and sometimes it was the South, until Hill at last, massing a great number of men on his left, charged with renewed courage and vigor. The Union men could not withstand their weight, and their flank was rolled up. Then Gordon and his Georgians marched into the willows that lined Rock Creek, forded the stream, and entered the field of wheat beyond. Harry saw this famous charge, and during a pause of the Invincibles, he watched it. The Georgians, although the cannon and rifles were now turned upon them, marched in perfect order, trampling down the yellow wheat which stood thick and tall before them. The sun glittered on their long lines of bayonets. Many men fell, but the ranks closed up and marched unflinchingly on. Then, as they came near their foe, they fired their own rifles and rushed forward. The men in blue were taken in the flank at the same time by Jubal Early, and 2 more brigades also rushed upon them. It was the same Union Corps, the 11th, that had suffered so terribly at Chancellorsville under the hammer strokes of Jackson, and now it was routed again. It practically dissolved for a time under the overwhelming rush on front and flank, and became a mass of fugitives. Harry heard for the first time that day the long, thrilling rebel yell of triumph, and both Howard and Doubleday, watching the battle intently, had become alarmed for their force. Howard was already sending messages to Meade, telling him that the great battle had begun and begging him to hurry with the whole army. Doubleday, seeing one flank crushed, was endeavoring to draw back the other, lest it be destroyed in its turn. Harry and Dalton and all the Invincibles felt the thrill of triumph shooting through them. They were advancing at last, making the first real progress of the day. Harry felt that the days of Jackson had come back. This was the way in which they had always driven the foe. Ewell himself was now upon the field. The loss of a leg had not diminished his ardor a whit. Everywhere his troops were driving the enemy before them, increasing the dismay which now prevailed in the ranks of men who had fought so well. Harry began to shout with the rest as the Southern torrent, irresistible now, flowed toward Gettysburg, while Ewell and Hill led their men. The town was filled with retreating Union troops, and the cannon and rifles thundered incessantly in the rear, driving them on. The whole southern curve was triumphant. Ewell's men entered the town after the fugitives, driving all before them and leaving Gettysburg in Southern hands. But the Northern army was not a mob. The men recovered their spirit and reformed rapidly. Many brave and gallant officers encouraged them, and a reserve had already thrown up strong entrenchments beyond the town on Cemetery Hill, to which they retreated and once more faced the enemy. Harry and Dalton stopped at Gettysburg, seeing the battle of the vanguards won, and turned back. Their place was with the general to the staff of whom they belonged, and they believed that they would not have to look far. With a battle that had lasted 8 hours, Lee surely would be upon the field by this time, or very near it. There were plenty of riderless horses, and capturing 2, one of which had belonged to a Union officer, they went back in search of their commander. It was a terrible field over which they had passed, strewed with human wreckage. Smoke and dust still floated over everything. They inquired as they advanced of officers who were just arriving upon the field, and one of them, pointing, said, "There is General Lee." Harry and Dalton saw him sitting on a horse on Seminary Ridge, his figure immovable, his eyes watching the Union brigades as they retreated up the slopes of the opposite hill. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sunlight was brilliant. The commander and his horse stood out like a statue on the hill, magnified in the blazing beams. Harry and his comrade paused to look at him for a few moments. Their spirits had risen when they saw him. They felt that since Lee had come, all things were possible, and when the whole of the 2 armies met in battle, the victory would surely be theirs. The 2 rode quietly into a group of staff officers gathered at a little distance behind Lee. They knew that it was not necessary now to make any report or explanation. Events reported for themselves, and explained everything also. Their comrades greeted them with nods, but Harry never ceased to watch Lee. The commander-in-chief, in his turn, was gazing at the panorama of battle, spread almost at his feet. Although the combat was dying, enough was left to give it a terrible aspect. The strife still went on in a part of Gettysburg, and cannon were thudding and rifles cracking. The flames from the houses set on fire by the shells streamed aloft like vast torches. Horses that had lost their riders galloped aimlessly, wild with terror. While he looked, General Hill rode up and joined them. Hill had been ill that day. His face was deadly in its pallor, and he swayed in his saddle from weakness. But his spirit and courage were high. Harry saw the 2 generals talking together, and again he glanced at the valley. After long and desperate fighting, the Southern victory had been complete. Any young lieutenant could see that. The whole Northern force was now being driven in great disorder upon Cemetery Hill, and a man like Jackson, without going to see Lee, would have hurled his whole force instantly upon those flying masses. Someone called Ewell and Hill, brave and able as they were, small change for Jackson, and the phrase often came to Harry's mind. Still, it was not possible to find any man or any 2 men who could fill the place of the great Stonewall. The day was far from over. At least 3 hours of sunlight were left. More Southern troops had come up, and Harry expected to see Lee launch his superior numbers against the defeated enemy. But he did not. There was some pursuit, but it was not pressed with vigor, and the victors stopped. Contradictory orders were given, it was claimed later, by the generals, but Lee, with the grandeur of soul that places him so high among the immortals, said afterward, "The attack was not pressed that afternoon because the enemy's force was unknown, and it was considered advisable to await the rest of our troops." When failure occurred, he never blamed anyone but himself. Yet Harry always thought that his genius paled a little that afternoon. He did not show the amazing vigor and penetration that were associated with the name of Lee, both before and afterwards. Perhaps it was an excess of caution, due to his isolated position in the enemy's country, and perhaps it was the loss of Jackson. Whatever it was, the precious hours passed. The enemy, small in numbers, was not driven from his refuge on Cemetery Hill, and the battle died. The Southern leaders themselves did not know the smallness of the Northern force that had taken shelter on the hill. That hardening of the resistance which Harry felt more than once had been exemplified to the full that deadly morning. Buford and Reynolds had shown the penetration and resolution of Jackson himself, and their troops had supported them with a courage and tenacity never surpassed in battle. Only 16 or 17,000 in number, they had left 10,000 killed or wounded around the town. But with only 1/3 of their numbers unhurt, they rallied anew on Cemetery Hill and once more turned defiant faces toward the enemy. Hancock, whose greatest day was also at hand, had arrived, sent forward in haste by Meade. Unsurpassed as a corps commander, and seeing the advantage of the position, he went among the beaten but willing remnants, telling them to hold on, as Meade and the whole Army of the Potomac were coming at full speed, and would be there to meet Lee in the South in the morning. Both commanding generals felt that the great battle was to be fought to a finish there. Meade had not yet arrived, but he was hurrying forward all divisions, ready to concentrate them upon Cemetery Hill. Lee also was bringing up all his troops, save the cavalry of Stuart, now riding on the raid around the Northern army and absent when they were needed most. Harry did not know for many days that this fierce first day and the gathering of the foes on Gettysburg was wholly unknown to both North and South. The two armies had passed out of sight under the horizon's rim, and the greatest battle of the war was to be fought unknown until its close to the rival sections. Harry and Dalton, keeping close together because they were comrades and because they felt the need of companionship, watched from their own hill the town and the hill beyond. Harry felt no joy. The victory was not yet to him a victory. He knew that the field below, terrible to the sight, was destined to become far more terrible, and the coming twilight was full of omens and presages. The sun sank at last upon the scene of human strife and suffering, but night brought with it little rest, because all through the darkness the brigades and regiments were marching toward the fatal field. End of Chapter 12, Part 2. Recording by Michael Packard. Chapter 13, Part 1 of The Star of Gettysburg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard. The Star of Gettysburg by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. Chapter 13. Gettysburg. Part 1. Harry took many messages that night, and he witnessed the gathering of the generals about Lee. He saw Ewell come, hobbling on his crutches, eager for battle and disappointed that they had not pushed the victory. Hill returned again, refusing to yield to his illness. And there was Longstreet, thick-bearded, the best fighter that Lee had since the death of Jackson. McLaws, Hood, Heth, Pender, Jubilee, Anderson, and others, veterans of many battles, great and small. They all talked long and earnestly, and pointed many times to the battlefield and the opposing heights. While they talked, a man appeared among the men in blue on Cemetery Hill, accompanied only by a staff officer and an orderly. He had ridden a long distance, and naturally lean and haggard, these traits in his appearance were exaggerated by weariness and anxiety. He looked as little like a great general as Jackson had looked in those days before he had sprung into fame. His military hat was black and broad of brim, and the brim, having become limp, drooped down over his face. There were spectacles on his nose, and it is said of him that he could have been taken more easily for a teacher than for a commander-in-chief. Thus Meade came to his army in the decisive moment of his country's life. He inspired neither enthusiasm nor discouragement. He looked upon those left from the battle and upon the brigades which had come since, thousands of men already sound asleep among the white stones of the churchyard. Then he turned in a calm and businesslike manner to the task of arranging a stern front for the storm which he knew would burst upon them tomorrow. The respect of his officers for him increased. Lee's generals went to their respective commands. Harry once more took orders, and as he carried messages or brought them back, he never failed to see all he could. The great corps of Ewell was drawn up on the battlefield of the day. Hill's forces extended to Willoughby Run, and the Southern line was complete along the whole curve. They also had the welcome news that Stuart at Carlisle had heard of the battle and would be present with the cavalry on the morrow. Harry, riding about in the darkness, recovered much of his spirits. The whole Southern army would be present in the morning, and while Jackson was dead, his spirit might ride again at their head. Now he awaited the dawn with confidence, believing that Lee would win another great victory. Harry was sent on his last errand far after midnight, and it took him to one of Ewell's divisions on the edge of Gettysburg. It was a clear night, with a bright summer sky, a good moon, and the stars in their myriads twinkling peacefully over the panorama of human passion and death. But they seemed very far away, and cold to the boy who was chilled by the night and the impending sense of mighty conflict. In Virginia they were fighting against the invader and in defense of their own soil. Now they were the invader, and it was the men in blue who defended. As he passed over that battlefield on which the dead and the badly hurt yet lay, his heart was dissolved for a time in sadness. The dead were thick all around him, and there were many hurt seriously, who were so still that he did not know whether they were alive or not. He heard very few groans. He noticed often on the battlefields that the hurt usually shut their teeth together and endured in silence. As he approached one of the little streams, a form twisted itself suddenly from his path. A weak voice exclaimed, "For God's sakes, don't step on me." Harry looked down. It was a boy with yellow hair, younger than himself. He could not have been over 16, but he wore a blue uniform, and a bullet had gone through his shoulder. Harry had a powerful sensation of pity. "I would not have stepped on you," he said. His duty urged him on, but his feelings would not let him go, and he added, "I'll help you." He lifted the lad, rapidly cut away his coat, and slicing it into strips, bound up tightly the two wounds in his shoulder where the bullet had gone in and where it had come out. "You've lost a lot of blood," he said. But you've got enough left to live on until you gather another supply, and you won't lose any more now." "Thank you," muttered the boy. "But you're very good for a rebel." Harry laughed. "Why, you innocent child," he said. "Have they been filling your head with tales of our ferocity and cruelty?" He went down to the stream, dipped up water in his cap, and brought it back to the boy, who drank eagerly. Then he placed him in a more comfortable position on the turf, and patting his head, said, "You'll get well, sure, and maybe you and I will meet after the war and be friends." All of which came true. Its like happened often in this war. But he went out of Harry's mind as he walked on and delivered his message in the edge of Gettysburg. He could not return before seeking the Invincibles, who were surely here in the vanguard, if they were yet alive. Harry shuddered. All his friends might have perished in that whirlwind of death. He soon learned that they had suffered greatly, but that those who were left were lying on the grass of what had been a lawn. He found the lawn quickly and saw dark figures strewn about upon the ground. They were so still and silent that they looked like the dead, but Harry knew that it was the stupor of exhaustion. As they were inside the lines and needing no watch, there was no sentinel. Harry stepped over the low fence and looked again at the figures. The moonlight silvered them, and they did not stir. He could not see a single form move. It was weird, uncanny, and the blood chilled in his veins. But he shook himself violently, angry at his weakness, and walked among them, looking for the 2 colonels and the 2 lieutenants. A figure suddenly sat up before him, and a dignified voice said, "Your footsteps awaken me, Harry, and if there is a message, I am here to receive it. But I ask you in the name of mercy to be quick. I was never before so much overpowered that I could not hold my head up a minute." Before Harry could speak, another figure arose. "Yes, Harry, be quick if you can, and let us go back to sleep," said Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire in a pleading voice. "Thank God I found you both. I have no message for you. I was merely looking to see if all of you were alive." "You've always had a kind heart, Harry," said Colonel Talbot, "and we can't tell you how much we appreciate what you've done." "Are St. Clair and Happy Tom here?" "I cannot tell you. We suffered from such tremendous exhaustion that our men fell upon the grass, we with them, and all of us sank into stupor. But, Harry, they must be here. You couldn't have lost those boys. Why, I can't think of them as not living." "If you let me make a suggestion, lie down and go to sleep again," said Harry. "I'll find 'em." The 2 colonels stretched a little, as if they were about to rise and go with him, but the effort was beyond their powers. They sank back and returned to sleep. Harry went on, his heart full of fear for the 2 young friends who were so dear to him. The survivors of the Invincibles lay in all sorts of positions, some on their backs, some on their sides, some on their faces, and others doubled up like little children. It was hard to recognize those dark figures. But he came at last to one in a lieutenant's uniform, and he was sure that it was Langdon. He was afraid at first that he was dead, but he put his hand on his shoulder and shook it. There was no response. But Harry felt the warmth of the body pass through the cloth to his hand, and he knew that Langdon was living. He shook him again. Happy opened his eyes slowly and regarded Harry with a long stare. "Are you a ghost?" he asked solemnly. "Nope, I was never more alive than I am now." "I don't believe you, Harry. You're a ghost, and so am I. Look at the dead men lying all around us." We're just the first up. Why, Harry, nobody could go through the crater of an active volcano we've done and live. I was either burned to death or shot to death with a bullet or blown into pieces with a shell. I don't know which, but it doesn't matter. What kind of country is this, Harry, into which we've been resurrected? Stop your foolishness, Happy. You're alive, all right. Although you may not be tomorrow night. The whole Army of the Potomac is coming up, and there's going to be another great battle. Then it's just as well that I'm alive, because General Lee will need me. But, Harry, don't you think I've answered enough questions, and that I've been awake long enough? Harry, remember that I'm your friend and comrade, almost your brother, and let me go back to sleep. Where's Sinclair? Was he killed? No. 1,000,000 shells burst over both of us, but we escaped them all. But Arthur will be dead to the world for a while just the same. He is a fourth figure beyond me, and you couldn't wake him if you fired a cannon in his ear. And in 2 minutes you won't be able to wake me with another cannon. Happy's head fell back as he spoke, and in less than half the time he gave, he joined the band of the original 7 sleepers. Harry, stepping lightly over the slumbering figures, he had left his horse on the hill, went back to the staff where he saw that many were yet watching. At the urgent advice of an older officer, he stretched himself between 2 blankets to protect his body from dew, and slept a little before dawn. He too had felt the exhaustion shown by the Invincibles, but his nervous system was keyed highly, too high, in fact, to sleep long. Moreover, he seemed to find some new reserve of strength, and when Dalton put his hand upon his shoulder, he sprang to his feet, eager and active. Dalton had not been sent on many errands the night before, and, sleeping longer than Harry, he had been up a half-hour earlier. "You'll find coffee and food for the staff back a little," said Dalton, "and I'd advise you to take breakfast, Harry." "I will. What's going on?" "Nothing, except the rising of the sun. See it, Harry? Just coming over the edge of the horizon, behind those 2 queer hills." The rim of the eastern sky was reddening fast, and Round Top and Little Round Top stood out against it, black and exaggerated. They were raised in the dawn, yet dim, to twice their height, and rose like gigantic towers. But there was light enough for Harry to see masses of men on the opposing slopes, and stone fences running along the hillsides, some of which had been thrown up in the night by soldiers. "I take it the whole Army of the Potomac is here," he said. "So our scouts tell us," replied Dalton. "Our forces are gathered too, except the 6,000 infantry under Pickett and McLaws, and the cavalry under Stuart, but they'll come." Harry and Dalton ate breakfast quickly, and, hurrying back, stood near their chief, ready for any service. All the Southern forces were in line. Heth held the right, Pender the left, and Anderson, Hood, and McLaws, and the others were stationed between. The brilliant sun moved slowly on, and flooded the town, the hills, and the battlefield of the day before with light. The officers of either side, with their powerful glasses, could see plainly the hostile troops. Harry had glasses of his own, and he looked a long time. But he saw little movement in the hostile ranks. Meade and Hancock and the others had worked hard in the hours of darkness, and the Army of the Potomac was ready. Harry expected to hear the patter of rifles. Surely the battle would open at once. But there was no sound of strife. It seemed instead that a great silence had settled over the 2 armies and all between. Perhaps each was waiting for the other to make the first cast of the dice. Harry studied Lee's face, but he could read nothing there. Like Jackson, he had the power of dismissing all expression. He wore a splendid new uniform, which had recently been sent to him by the devoted people of Virginia, and with his height and majestic figure, his presence had never seemed more magnificent than on that morning. It was usually he who opened the battle, never waiting for the enemy. But as yet he gave no order. Longstreet, Hill, and Hood presently joined Lee, and the four walked a little higher up the ridge, where they examined the Northern army for a long time with their glasses. Lee must have recognized the strength of that position, the formidable ridges, the stone walls bristling with batteries, all crowned with an army of veterans more numerous than his own, and even when Stuart and Pickett should come, more numerous yet by 15,000 men. But his army was in the habit of victory, was eager for battle, sure it could win, despite the numbers and position of the enemy. The generals came back, but Lee said little. Harry often wished that he could have penetrated the mind of the great commander that morning, a mind upon which so much hung, and which must have been assailed by doubts and fears, despite the impenetrable mask of his face. But he did not yet give any orders to attack, and Harry and Dalton, who had nothing to do but look on, were amazed. There was the Army of the Potomac waiting, and it was not Lee's habit to let it wait. Slow as the sun was, it was now far up the Blue Arch, and the day was intensely hot. The golden beams poured down, and everything seemed to leap out into the light. Harry clearly saw the Northern cannon, and now and then he saw an officer moving about, but the men in blue were mostly still, lying upon their arms. The troops of his own army were quiet also, and they too were lying down. It suddenly occurred to Harry that no more fitting field for a great and decisive battle could have been chosen. It was like a vast arena, enclosed by the somber hills and the two round tops, on both of which flew the flags of the Union signalmen. Yet the day drew on. The two armies of nearly 200,000 men merely sat and stared at each other. Noon passed, and the afternoon advanced. Harry yet wondered, as many another did. But it was not for him to criticize. They were led by a man of genius, and the great mind must be working, seeking the best way. He and Dalton and some others lay down on the grass, while the heavy silence still endured. Not a single cannon shot had been fired all that day, and soon the sun would begin its decline from the zenith. "I think I'll go to sleep," said Dalton. "You couldn't if you tried," said Harry, "and you know it. If General Lee is waiting, it's because he has good reasons for waiting, and you know that too. You're right in both instances, Harry. I could never shut my eyes on a scene like this, and late as it grows, there will yet be a battle today. Weren't some orders sent along the line a little while ago?" "Yes, the older men took 'em. What time is it, George?" 4 o'clock. Then he closed his watch with a snap and added, "The battle has begun." The heavy rapport of a cannon came from the southern right under Longstreet. It sped up the valleys and returned in sinister echoes. It was succeeded by silence for a moment, and then the whole earth shook beneath a mighty shock. All the batteries along the southern line opened, pouring a tremendous volume of fire upon the whole northern position. The young officers leaped to their feet. A volcano had burst. The Union batteries were replying, and the front of both armies blazed with fire. The smoke hung high, and Harry and Dalton could see in the valley beneath it. They caught the gleam of bayonets, and saw the troops of Longstreet advancing in heavy masses to the assault of the slope where the peach trees grew, now known as the Peach Orchard. Here stood the New Yorkers, who had been thrust forward under Sickles, a rough politician, but brave and in many respects capable. There was some confusion among them as they awaited the Confederates, Sickles, it is charged, having gone too far in his zeal, and then endeavoring to fall back when it was too late. But the men under him were firm. On this field, the two great states of New York and Pennsylvania, through the number of troops they furnished for it, bore the brunt of the battle. Harry and Dalton, crouched down in order that they might see better under the smoke, watched the thrilling and terrible spectacle. The Southern vanguard was made up of Texans, tall, strong, tanned men, led by the impetuous Hood, and shouting the fierce Southern war cry, they rushed straight at the corps of Sickles. The artillery and rifle fire swept through their ranks, but they did not falter. Many fell, but others rushed on, and Harry, although unconscious of it, began to shout as he saw them cross a little stream and charge with all their might against the enemy. The combat was stubborn and furious. The men of Sickles redoubled their efforts. At some points their line was driven in, and the Texans sought to take their artillery. But at others they held fast and even threatened the southern flank. They knew, too, that reinforcements were promised to them, and they encouraged one another by saying they were already in sight. Harry could not turn his eyes away from this struggle, much of which was hidden in the smoke, and all of which was confused. The cannon of Hill and Ewell were thundering elsewhere, but here was the crucial point. The Round Tops rose on one side of the combatants. Round Top itself seemed too lofty and steep for troops, but Little Round Top, accessible to both men and cannon, would dominate the field, and he believed that Hood, as soon as his men crushed Sickles, would whirl about and seize it, but he could not yet tell whether fortune favored the blue or the gray. The generals from both sides watched the struggle with intense anxiety, and hurried forward fresh troops. Woods and rocks and slopes helped the defense, but the attack was made with superior numbers. Longstreet himself was directing the action, and a part of Hill's men were coming up to his aid. Sedgwick and Sykes, able generals, were rushing to help Sickles. The whole combat was beginning to concentrate about the furious struggle for the Peach Orchard and the Little Round Top. Hood, in all the height of the struggle, saw the value of Little Round Top and tried his utmost to seize it. Again, the Northern generals were to show that they had learned how to see what should be done and to do it at once. Little Round Top rose up, dominant over the whole field, a prize of value beyond all computation. Just then it was the most valuable hill in all the world. A Northern general, Warren, a chief engineer of the army, had seen the value of Little Round Top as quickly as Hood. The signalmen were about to leave, but he made them stay. An entire brigade hurrying to the battle was passing the slope, when Warren literally seized upon them by force of command and rushed the men and their cannon to the crest. Hood's soldiers were already climbing the slopes, when the fire of the brigade's shell and bullets struck almost in their faces. Harry, watching through his glasses, saw them reel back, and then go on again, firing their own rifles as they climbed over the rocky sides of Little Round Top. Again that fierce volley assailed them, crashing through their ranks, and again they went on into the flames and the smoke. Harry saw the battle raging around the crest of Little Round Top. Then he uttered a cry of despair. The Southerners, with their ranks thin, woefully thin, were falling back, slowly and sullenly. They had done all that soldiers could do, but the commanding towers of Little Round Top remained in Union hands, and the Union generals were soon crowding it with artillery that could sweep every point of the field below. But Sickles himself was not faring so well. His men, fighting for every inch of ground about the Peach Orchard, were slowly driven back. Sickles himself fell, a leg shattered, and walked on one leg for more than 50 years afterwards. Hood, his immediate opponent, also fell, losing an arm then and a leg later at Chickamauga. But Longstreet still pushed the attack, and the Northern generals who had stood around Sickles resisted with the stubbornness of men who meant to succeed or die. Early in the battle, Harry had seen General Lee walk forward to a point in the center of his line and sit down on a smooth stump. There he sat a long time, apparently impassive. Harry sometimes took his eyes away from the combat for the peach orchard and Little Round Top to watch his commander-in-chief. But the general never showed emotion. Now and then General Hill or his military secretary, General Long, came to him, and they would talk a little together, but they made no gestures. Lee would rise when his generals came, but when they left he would resume his place on the stump and watch the struggle through his glasses. Throughout the whole battle of that day, he sent a single order and received but one message. He had given his orders before the advance, and left the rest to his lieutenants. "I wish I could be as calm as he is," said Harry. "I'll risk saying he isn't calm inside," said Dalton. "How could any man be at such a time?" "You're right. Duck, here comes a shell!" But the shell fell short and exploded on the slope. "Now listen, will you?" exclaimed Harry. "That's the spirit!" Immediately after the shells burst, a Southern band began to play, and it played the merriest music, waltzes and polkas, all kinds of dances. Harry felt his feet move to the tunes, while the battle below, at its very height, roared and thundered. But he promptly forgot the musicians as he watched the battle. He knew that the Invincibles were somewhere in that volcano of fire and smoke, and it was almost too much to hope that they would again come unhurt out of such a furious conflict. But they too passed quickly from his mind. The struggle would let nothing else remain there long. He saw that the Union troops were still in the peach orchard, and that they were pouring a deadly fire also from Little Round Top. Hancock had come to take the place of Sickles, and he was drawing every man he could to his support. The afternoon was waning, but the battle was still at its height. Men were falling by thousands, and generals, colonels, majors, officers of all kinds were falling with them. The Southerners had not encountered such resistance in any other great battle, and the ground, moreover, was against them. Yet the grim fighter Longstreet never ceased to push on his brigades. The combat was now often face to face, and sharpshooters, hidden in every angle and hollow of the earth, picked off men by hundreds. The great rocky mass known as the Devil's Den was filled with Northern sharpshooters, and for a long time they stung the Southern flank terribly, until a Southern battery, noticing whence the deadly stream of bullets issued, sprayed it with grape and canister until most of the sharpshooters were killed, while those who survived fled like wolves from their lairs. The day was now passing, but Harry could see no decrease in the fury of the battle. Longstreet was still hurling his men forward, and they were met with cannon and rifle and bayonet. The Confederate line now grew more compact. The brigades were brought into closer touch, and gathering their strength anew, they rushed forward in a charge, heavier and more desperate than any that had gone before. Generals and colonels led them in person. Barksdale, young but with snow-white hair, was riding at the very front of the line, and he fell, dying in the Union ranks. The Southern charge was stopped again on the left wing of the Union army, and with the coming of the night the battle there sank, but elsewhere the South was meeting with greater success. Ewell, making a renewed and fierce attack at sunset, drove in the Northern right, and, seconded by Early, took their defenses there. But the darkness was coming fast, and although the firing went on for a long time, it ceased at last, with the two enemies still face to face and the battle drawn. Harry, who had expected to see a glorious victory won by the setting of the sun, was deeply depressed. His youth did not keep him from seeing that very little advantage had been won in that awful conflict of the afternoon, And he saw also that the Army of the Potomac had been fighting as if it had been improved by defeat. Nor had Lee thrown in his whole force where it was needed most. If Jackson had only been there! Harry pictured his swift flank movement, his lightning stroke, and the crumpling up of the enemy. Jackson loomed larger than ever now to his disappointed and excited mind. End of Chapter 13, Part 1. Recording by Michael Packard. Chapter 13, Part 2 of The Star of Gettysburg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard. The Star of Gettysburg by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. Chapter 13. Gettysburg. Part 2. Harry had been all day long and far into the night on Seminary Hill. Often he had scarcely moved for an hour, and now, when the firing ceased, and he stood up and tried to peer into the valley of death, he found his limbs so stiff for a minute or two that he could scarcely move. His eyes ached, and his throat was raw from smoke and the fumes of burned gunpowder. But as he shook himself and stretched his muscles, he regained firmness of both mind and body. "We didn't win much," he said to Dalton. "Not today, but we will tomorrow. Harry, wasn't it awful? It looks to me down there like a pit of destruction." And Dalton described it truly. The losses of the day before had been doubled. 30,000 men on the two sides had now fallen, and there was another day to come. Harry saw that the generals themselves were assailed by doubts and fears. He, with other young staff officers, witnessed the council of Lee and his leading officers in the moonlight on Seminary Ridge. Some spoke of retreat. A drawn battle in the enemy's country, and with an inferiority of numbers, was for them equivalent to a defeat. Others pointed out, however, that while their losses had been enormous, the courage and spirit of the Army of Northern Virginia were unshaken. Stuart with the cavalry, expected earlier, would certainly be up soon, and after all, the day had not been without its gains. Longstreet held the peach orchard, and Ewell was in the Union defenses on the flank of Gettysburg. But Lee thought most of the troops, these ragged veterans of his, who had been invincible, asked to be led once more against the enemy. A spirit so high as theirs could not be denied. His decision was given. They would stay and smash the Union army on the morrow. Harry heard of the decision. He had never doubted that it would be so. They must surely win the next day with the addition of Pickett's men and Stuart's cavalry. He wondered why Stuart had not come up already, but he learned the next morning that a good reason had held him back. The Union cavalry, always vigilant now, had intercepted Stuart in the afternoon and had given him battle. Just when the combat of the second day had begun at Gettysburg, Gregg led the horsemen in blue, and there was another combat like that at Brandy Station, now about 5,000 sabers on a side. There was a long and desperate struggle in which neither force could win, young Custer in particular showing uncommon skill and courage for the North, while Wade Hampton performed prodigies for the South. At last they drew off by mutual consent, Gregg into the forest, while Stuart, with his reduced force, rode on in the night to Lee. But Gregg, in holding back Stuart, had struck the Union army a great blow. Harry and Dalton, with nothing to do, received permission to go among the soldiers, and as they marked their spirits, their own rose. Then they passed down toward the battlefield. Harry had some idea that they might again find the Invincibles as they had found them the night before, but their time was too short. The Invincibles were somewhere in the front, he learned, and, disappointed, he and Dalton turned back into the valley. The night was clear and bright, and they saw many men coming and going from a cold spring under the shadow of the trees. Some of them were wounded and limped painfully. Others carried away water in their hats and caps for comrades too badly wounded to move. Harry observed that some wore the blue and some the gray. Both he and Dalton were assailed by a burning thirst at the sight of the water, and they went to the spring. Here men who, an hour or two ago, had been striving their utmost to kill one another were gathered together and spoke as friends. When one went away, another took his place. No thought of strife occurred to them, although there would be plenty of it on the morrow. They even jested, and foes complimented foes on their courage. Harry and Dalton drank, and paused a few moments to hear the talk. The moon rode high, and it has looked down upon no more extraordinary scene than this. The enemies drinking together in friendship at the spring, and all about them the stony ramparts of the hills, bristling with cannon and covered with riflemen, ready for a red dawn, and the fields and ridges on which 30,000 had already fallen dead or wounded. "Another meeting, Mr. Kenton," said a man who had been bent down drinking. As he rose, the moonlight shone full upon his face, and Harry was startled. And yet it was not strange that he would be there. The face revealed to Harry was one of uncommon power. It seemed to him that the features had grown more massive. The powerful chin and the large, slightly curved nose showed indomitable spirit and resolution. The face was tanned almost to blackness by all kinds of weather. Harry would not have known him at first, had it not been for his voice. "We do meet in unexpected places and at unexpected times, Mr. Shepherd," he said. "I am not merely trying to be polite when I tell you that I'm glad to find you alive. You and I have seen battles, but never another like this. And I can truthfully welcome you, Mr. Shepherd, as an old acquaintance and no real enemy." It was an impulse, but a noble one, that made the two, different in years and so unalike, shake hands with a firm and honest grip. "Your army will come again in the morning," said Shepherd, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Can you doubt it?" "No, I don't. But tomorrow night, Mr. Kenton, you will recall what I told you at our first meeting in Montgomery more than 2 years ago. You said that we could not win, and you cannot. It was never possible. Oh, I know that you've won great victories against odds. You've done better than anybody could have expected, but you had genius to help you, while we were led by mediocrity in the saddle. But you have reached your zenith. Mark how the Union veterans fought today. They're as brave and resolute as you are, and we have the position and men. You'll never get beyond Gettysburg. Your invasion is over. Hereafter, you fight always on the defensive." Harry was startled by his emphasis. The man spoke like an inspired prophet of old. His eyes sparkled like coals of fire in the dark, tanned face. The boy had never seen him show so much emotion, and his heart sank at the appalling prophecy. Then his courage came back. "You predict as you hope, Mr. Shepherd," he said. Shepherd laughed a little, though not with mirth, and said, "It is well it should be settled here. There will be death on a greater scale than any the war has yet seen. And it will have to come sooner or later, and why not at Gettysburg? Goodbye. I go back to the heights, May we both be alive tomorrow night to see which is right." "The wish is mine, too," said Harry sincerely. Shepard turned away and disappeared in the darkness. Harry rejoined Dalton, who was on the other side of the spring, and the two returned to Seminary Ridge while they walked among sleeping thousands. They found their way to their comrades on the staff, and, their physical powers collapsing at last, they fell on the ground, where they soon sank into a heavy sleep. The great silence came again. Sentinels walked back and forth along the hostile lines, but they made no noise. There was little moving of brigades or cannon now. The town itself became a town of phantom houses in the moonlight, nearly all of them still and deserted. On all the slopes of the hostile ridges lay the sleeping soldiers, and on the rocks and fields between lay the dead in thousands. But from the crest of Little Round Top, the precious hill so hardly won, the Union officers watched all through the night, and now and then they went through the batteries, for which they were sure they were going to have great use. Harry and Dalton awoke at the same time. Another day, hot and burning, had come, and the two armies once more looked across the valley at each other. Harry soon heard the booming of cannon off to his right, where Ewell's corps stood. It came from the northern guns, and for a long time those of the south did not answer. But after a while, Harry's practiced ear detected the reply. The hostile wings facing each other were engaged in a fierce battle. He saw the flash of guns and the rising smoke, but the center of the Army of Northern Virginia and the other wing did not yet move. He looked questioningly at Dalton, and Dalton looked questioningly at him. They expected every instant that the combats would spread along the entire front, but it did not. For several hours they listened to the thunder of the guns on the left, and then they knew by the movement of the sounds that the southern wing had been driven back. Not far, it is true, but still it had been compelled to yield, and again Harry's heart sank. But it rose once more when he concluded that Lee must be massing his forces in the center. The left wing had been allowed to fight against overwhelming numbers in order that the rest of the army might be left free to strike a crushing blow. Then noon came, and the battle on their left died completely. Once more the great silence held the field, and Harry was mystified and awed. Lee, as calm and impassive as ever, said little. The ridges confronted one another, bristling with cannon, but the armies were motionless. The day was hotter than either of those that had gone before. The sun, huge and red, poised in the heavens, shot down fiery rays in millions. Harry gasped for breath, and when at last he spoke in the stillness, his voice sounded loud and harsh in his own ears. "What does it mean, George?" he said. "I don't know, but I think they're massing behind us for a charge." "Not against the 60 or 70,000 men and the scores of cannon on those heights." "Maybe not yet. It's likely there will be a heavy artillery fire first." "Yes, I'm right. There go the guns." One cannon shot was followed by many others, and then for a while a tremendous cannonade raged along the front of the armies. And it too died. The smoke lifted, and then came the breathless, burning heat again. The fire of the sun and of the battle entered Harry's brain. The valley, the town, the hills, the armies, everything swam in a red glare. The great pulses leaped in his throat. He was anxious for them to go on and get it over. Why were the generals lingering when there was a battle to be finished? Half the day had gone already, and nothing was decided. Conscious that he was about to lose control of himself, he clasped his hands to his temples and pressed them tightly. At the same time he made a mighty effort of the will. The millions of black specks that had been dancing before his eyes went away. The solid earth ceased to quiver and settled back into its place, careless of the armies that trampled over it. Again he clearly saw through his glasses the long lines of men in blue along the slopes and on the crest of Cemetery Hill. He marked, too, there, at the highest point, a clump of trees wavering their summer green in the hot sunshine. Turning his glasses yet further, he saw the massed artillery on Little Round Top, and the gunners leaning on their guns. A house set on fire purposely or by shells was burning brightly, like some huge torch to light the way to death. "You told me they were preparing for a charge," he said to Dalton. "So they are, Harry. Pickett's men, who have not been here long, are forming up in the rear, but their advance will be preceded by a cannonade. You can see them wheeling guns into line." Lee, with Hill and Longstreet, had recently ridden along the lines, followed by older staff officers, and often shells and the bullets of sharpshooters had struck about them, but they remained unhurt. Now Lee stopped at once at his old points of observation. It was now about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and as the last gun took its place, the whole artillery of the Southern army opened with a fire so tremendous that Harry felt the earth trembling, and he was compelled to put his fingers in his ears lest he be deafened. A storm of metal flew across the valley toward the northern ranks, but the guns there did not reply yet. The Union troops lay close behind their entrenchments, and mostly the storm beat itself to pieces on the side of the hill. The smoke soon became so great that Harry could not even tell with glasses what was going on in the enemy's ranks, but he inferred from the fact that they were not yet replying that they were not suffering much. But in a quarter of an hour, the tremendous cannonade was suddenly doubled in volume. The Union guns were now answering. 200 cannon facing one another across the valley were firing the most terrible artillery duel ever known in America. The air was filled with shells, shot, grape, shrapnel, canister, and every form of deadly missile. Harry and Dalton sprang to cover as some of the shells struck about them, but they stood up again when they saw that Lee was talking calmly with his generals. The Southern fire was accurate. General Meade's headquarters were riddled. Many important officers were wounded, but the Northern gunners, superb always, never flinched from their guns. They fell fast, but others took their places. Guns were dismounted, but those in the reserve were brought up instead. The appalling tumult increased. The shells shrieked as they flew through the air in hundreds, and shrapnel and grape whined incessantly. Harry thought it in very truth the Valley of Destruction, and it was a relief to him when he received an order to carry and could turn away for a little while. He saw now in the rear the brigades of Pickett, which were forming up for the charge, about 4,500 men who had not yet been in the battle, while nearly 10,000 more, under Trimble, Pettigrew, and Wilcox, were ready to march on their flanks. Pickett's men were lying on their arms, patiently waiting. The time had not quite come. When Harry came back from his errand, the cannonade was still at its height. The roar was continuous, deafening, shaking the earth all the time. A light wind blew the smoke back on the Southern position, but it helped, concealing their batteries to a certain extent, while those of the North remained uncovered. The Northern army was now suffering terribly, although its infantry stood unflinching under the fire, but the South was suffering too. Guns were shattered, and a deadly rain of missiles carried destruction into the waiting regiments. Harry saw Lee and Longstreet continually under the Union fire. They visited the batteries and encouraged the men. Showers of shells struck around them, but they went on unharmed. Wherever Lee appeared, the tremendous cheering could be heard amid the roar of the guns. Now the Southern artillerymen saw that their ammunition was diminishing fast. Such a furious and rapid fire could not be carried on much longer, and Lee sent the word to Pickett to charge. Harry stood by when the men of Pickett arose, but not all of them. Some had been struck by the shells as they lay on the ground and had died in silence, but their comrades marched out in splendid array, and a vast shout arose from the Southern army as they strove straight into the valley of death. Harry shouted with the rest. He was wild with excitement. Every nerve in him tingled, and once more the black specks danced before his eyes in myriads. Peace or war, right or wrong, he was always glad that he saw Pickett's charge. The charge that dimmed all other charges in history. The most magnificent proof of man's courage and ability to walk straight into the jaws of death. The dauntless Virginians marched out in even array, stepping steadily as if they were on parade instead of aiming straight at the center of the Union Army, where 50,000 riflemen and 100 guns were awaiting them. Their generals and those of the supporting divisions rose on their flanks or at their head. Besides Pickett, Garnett, Wilcox, Armistead, Pettigrew, and Trimble were there. The Southern cannon were firing over the heads of the marching Virginians, covering them with their fire, but the light breeze strengthened a little, driving away the smoke. There they were in the valley, visible to both friend and foe, marching on that long mile from hill to hill. The Southern army shouted again, and it is true that at this moment the Union ranks burst into a cry of admiration at the sight of a foe so daring, men of their own race and country. But Harry never took his eyes for a moment from Pickett's column. He was using his glasses, and everything stood out strong and clear. The sun was at the zenith, pouring down rays so fiery that the whole field blazed in light. The nature of the ground caused the Virginians to turn a little in order to keep the line for the Union center, but they preserved their even ranks and marched on at a steady pace. Harry began to shout again, and in an instant or two he saw a line of fire pass along the Union front. 40 guns together opened upon the charging column, and Hancock, at the Union center, seeing and understanding the danger, was heaping up men and cannon to meet it. The shells began to crash into the ranks of the Virginians and the 10,000 on their flanks. Men fell in hundreds, and now the batteries on Little Round Top added to the storm of fire. The clouds of smoke gathered again, but the wind presently scattered them, and Harry, waiting in agony, saw Pickett's division marching straight ahead, never faltering. But he groaned when he saw that there was trouble on the flanks. The men of Pettigrew, exhausted by the great efforts they had already made in the battle, wavered and lost ground. Another division was driven back by a heavy flank attack. Others were lost in the vast banks of smoke that at times filled the valley. Only the Virginians kept unbroken ranks and a straight course for the Union center. Pickett paused a few moments at the burning house for the others to get in touch with him, but they could not do so, and he marched on, with Cemetery Hill now only 200 yards away. The covering fire of the Southern cannon had ceased long since. It would have been as dangerous now to friend as to foe. Harry, watching through his glasses, uttered another cry. Pickett and his men were marching alone at the hill. Half of them, it seemed to him, were gone already, but the other half never paused. The fire of 100 guns had been poured upon them as they advanced that deadly mile, but with ranks still even. They rushed straight at their mark, the Union center. Then Harry saw all the slopes and the crest of Cemetery Hill blaze with fire. The Virginians were near enough for the rifles now, and the bullets came in sheets. Harry saw it, and he groaned aloud. He no longer had any hope for those brave men. The charge could not succeed. Yet he saw them rush into the Union ranks and disappear. A group in gray, still cleaving through the multitude, reappeared far up the slope, and then burst, a little band of a few dozen men, into the very heart of the Union center, the point to which they had been sent. A battle raged for a few minutes under the clump of trees where Hancock had stood directing. There Armistead, who had led them, his hat on the point of his sword, fell dead among the Union guns. And Cushing, his brave foe who commanded the battery, died beside him. All the others fell quickly and were taken. A few hundreds on the slope cut their way back through the Union army and reached their own. Pickett, preserved by some miracle, was among them. Harry gasped and threw down his glasses. Now he knew that the words Shepard had spoken to him the night before at the spring were true. The Southern invasion had been rolled back forever. He looked at General Lee, who on foot had been watching the charge. The impenetrable mask was gone for a moment, and his face expressed deep emotion. Then the great soul reasserted itself, and, mounting his horse, went forward to meet the fugitives and encourage them. He rode back and forth among them, and Harry heard him say once, "All will come right in the end. We'll talk it over afterward. But meanwhile every good man must rally. We want all good and true men just now." His manner was that of a father to his children, and though they had failed, the spontaneous cheers again burst forth wherever he passed. The wounded, as they were carried to the rear, raised themselves to see him, and their cheers were added to the others. Harry never forgot anything that he saw and heard then. Although the battle in effect was over, the Northern artillery, roaring and thundering triumphantly, was sending its shells across the valley and upon Seminary Ridge. But he did not think anything of them, even when they struck near him. It would be days before he could feel fear again. He heard Lee say to an officer who rode up and stated between sobbing breaths that his whole brigade was destroyed. "Never mind, General. All this has been my fault. It is I who have lost this fight, and you must help me out of it the best way you can." To another he said, "This has been a sad day for us. A sad day, but we can't expect always to gain victories." Beholding such greatness of soul, Harry regained his own composure. He rejoined Dalton, and soon they saw the Southern army reform its lines and turn a bristling front to the enemy. The Northern cannon were still flashing and thundering, but the Northern army made no return attack. Gettysburg, in all respects the greatest battle ever fought on the American continent, was over, and 50,000 men had fallen. The sun set, and Harry at last sank on the ground, overpowered. The next day the two armies stood on their hills, looking at each other, but neither cared to renew the battle after such frightful losses. That afternoon a fearful storm of thunder Lightning and rain burst over the field. It seemed to Harry an echo of the real battle of the day before. That night, Lee, having gathered up his wounded, his guns and his wagons, began his retreat toward the south. His army had lost, but it was still in perfect order, willing, even anxious to fight again. The wagons containing the wounded and the stores stretched for many miles, moving along in the rain, and the cavalry rode on their flanks to protect them. It was not until the next morning that Harry discovered anything of the Invincibles. In the dawn he saw a covered wagon by the side of which rode an officer, much neater in appearance than the others. He knew at once it was Sinclair, and he galloped forward in a joyous shout. "Arthur! Arthur!" he cried. St. Clair turned a pale face that lighted up at the sight of his friend. "Thank God you're alive, Harry," he said with his hands clasped. "Are you alone left?" asked Harry. "Look in the wagon," he said. Harry lifted a portion of the flap, and, looking in, saw Colonel Leonidas Talbot and Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire sitting on rolls of blankets facing each other. One had his right arm in a sling, and the other the left, but the chessmen rested on a board between them, and they were playing intently. They stopped a moment or two and gave Harry a glad welcome. Then he let the flap drop back. "They began at daylight," said St. Clair. "Where's Happy?" "He's in the wagon, too. He's lying on some blankets behind them." "Not hurt badly?" "He was nipped in the shoulder, but it doesn't amount to anything. What he wanted was sleep, and he's getting it. He told me not to wake him up again for a month." "Well, Arthur, we lost." "Yes, and I don't know just how it happened." "But we're here, ready to fight again whenever they come." "So we are, Harry. And if they ever reach Richmond, it will be many a long day before they do it." "I say so, too." The great train toiled on through the mud, and the Army of Northern Virginia continued its slow march southward. End of Chapter 13, Part 2. End of The Star of Gettysburg by Joseph A. ALTSHELER. Recording by Michael Packard.